Hey guys, tonight we trudge through the quiet aftermath of history's deadliest pandemic, stepping carefully around mass graves and abandoned villages to discover what happened when the Black Death finally loosened its grip on medieval Europe. You're standing in the spring of 1353, the air still thick with the memory of death, and everywhere you look, the world has changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The crops are growing wild because there's nobody left to harvest them. The church bells have stopped tolling for the dead because the bell ringers themselves are gone. And you, assuming you somehow survived the bubonic plague, the pneumonic variant, and probably 3 separate waves of infection, are now living in what might be the strangest economic and social experiment in human history. You probably wouldn't have survived this, statistically speaking, but let's pretend you're one of the lucky ones. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this community stretches across time zones, from someone drifting off in Tokyo to another listener settling into a rainy London evening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes one morning and realise the screaming has stopped. Not gradually, not with any formal announcement, but simply because there's no one left to scream. The plague that swept through your village, through every village, every town, every bustling city from Sicily to Scandinavia, has moved on like a bored predator seeking fresher hunting grounds. For 3, maybe 4 years, you watched your world dissolve, your neighbours, your family, the priest who baptised you, the baker whose bread you ate every morning. Gone, all of them. Their bodies carted away in those awful wagons or simply left to rot where they fell when the cart pullers themselves succumbed. But now you stand in your doorway, and the spring sun is warm on your face, and you're breathing air that doesn't quite carry that terrible sweetness of decay anymore. Birds are singing. Somewhere in the distance a cow is lowing, probably wondering why nobody has come to milk her in days. You're alive, and you have absolutely no idea what comes next. This is the moment historians rarely dwell on. Not the dramatic dying, but the awkward, disorienting surviving. You've been so focused on not catching the pestilence, on avoiding the sick, on praying and fasting and burning herbs and doing all those things that probably didn't help but made you feel like you were doing something, that you never really considered what life would look like on the other side. And now here it is, sprawling before you like an overgrown garden, and you're supposed to just continue. You walk through your village, and the silence is almost physical. It presses against your ears. You're used to the sounds of medieval life, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of women at the well, the shouts of children playing in the muddy streets, the eternal background chorus of livestock and commerce, and humanity packed tightly together. But now your footsteps echo off empty cottages. Doors hang open on leather hinges creaking in the breeze. A chicken pecks its way across the lane, looking as confused as you feel. You pass the house where Thomas the Tanner lived with his wife and 7 children. The smell that always emanated from his workshop, that eye-watering stench of urine and animal hides that you complained about constantly, is fading now. You'd give anything to smell it again, because it would mean Thomas was still there, still working, still alive. But the tanning pits are still, the hides rotting in their baths, and Thomas and his entire family are buried in the mass grave behind the church, along with what you estimate to be about half the village. Half. Let that sink in for a moment as you stand there in the spring sunshine. Half the people you knew your entire life, gone in the span of months. Historians still argue whether the mortality rate was closer to 30% or 60%, and honestly, when you're standing in the middle of it, the precise numbers feel almost obscene to calculate. You just know that the village feels like a mouth missing most of its teeth, and every familiar corner holds the ghost of someone who should still be there. You make your way to the manor house, because even in the midst of apocalyptic death, the feudal system theoretically still exists, and you technically still owe labour to Lord Geoffrey. The manor looks the same as always, imposing stone walls, narrow windows, the family crest carved above the entrance. But when you approach the gate, there's no guard to challenge you. You wander through the courtyard, past the empty stables, past the silent kitchens, and finally you find old Walter, the steward, sitting on a bench in the herb garden staring at nothing. Walter looks up at you with eyes that have seen too much, and he laughs. Not a joyful sound, but something hollow and wondering. "You're alive," he says, as if confirming a miracle. "I'm alive," you agree, because what else is there to say? Walter tells you that Lord Geoffrey died 3 weeks ago. So did Lady Margaret. So did their eldest son and heir, young Richard. The only surviving member of the family is a distant cousin nobody's ever met, who lives somewhere in Lincolnshire and probably doesn't even know he's just inherited an estate. This is the reality settling over Europe like a strange, unsettling fog. The plague has receded, not vanished entirely, mind you, because it will return in waves over the coming decades, a recurring nightmare that never quite lets go. But the initial catastrophic outbreak is over, and in its wake, it has left a landscape so transformed that the survivors barely recognise it. The old certainties have crumbled along with the old population. The church promised that faith would protect the righteous, but the righteous died alongside the sinners. The nobles promised order and protection in exchange for labour and loyalty, but they died in their manor houses while peasants died in their hovels, the plague caring nothing for bloodlines or titles. You find yourself in an economic situation that would make modern labour economists weep with fascination. Before the plague, land was the scarce resource, and labour was abundant. Lords could demand whatever they wanted from their peasants because there were always more peasants, desperate hungry peasants who would work for subsistence wages just to survive. But now you walk past empty fields that stretch to the horizon, good fertile fields with nobody to plough them. You pass workshops with looms and forges and tools, all sitting idle because their masters are dead and buried. And slowly, tentatively, something dawns on you that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. They need you now. The lords who survived, the merchants who made it through, the remaining landowners desperate to work their estates. They need hands to hold the plough, backs to carry the loads, bodies to fill the empty positions that death has created. And there simply aren't enough of you to go around. This is where it gets interesting, historically speaking, because medieval peasants weren't stupid. They could count empty houses as well as anyone. They could see the desperation in their lord's eyes when he came around asking, not demanding, whether anyone might be willing to help with the spring planting. And for the first time in generations, maybe for the first time ever, ordinary working people began to understand that they had something that the powerful wanted, and that gave them a kind of leverage their grandparents couldn't have imagined. You hear the stories trickling in from other villages, carried by the few travellers brave enough to move through the post-plague landscape. In a town 2 days' walk from here, a group of peasants simply refused to work their lord's fields until he agreed to pay them actual wages. Coins, real money, not just permission to farm their own tiny strips of land. And the lord, after sputtering with outrage for a few days, actually paid. What else could he do? The crops wouldn't plant themselves, and the alternative was watching his estate crumble into bankruptcy. In another village, the local miller died, leaving behind a perfectly good mill and no heir to run it. A peasant named Robert, who had always been handy with mechanisms and had once dreamed of being more than a serf, simply walked in and took over the operation. When someone questioned his right to do so, Robert reportedly shrugged and said, "The grain won't grind itself, and I'm the only one left who knows how." And just like that, Robert became a miller, a skilled tradesman, a man of property, a person whose children would grow up in circumstances unimaginably better than his own childhood. This is the eerie silence breaking, you see. Not with a triumphant fanfare or a royal proclamation, but with 1,000 small negotiations, 1,000,000 tiny shifts in the balance of power. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a system. It killed the comfortable assumption that there would always be more labourers than labour needed, that the powerful could take peasant compliance for granted, that the social order was as fixed and eternal as the stars in the sky. When the silence finally broke, what emerged was something new, something unstable, something that would reshape European society for centuries to come. You stand in the herb garden with old Walter, watching the sun move slowly across the sky, and you realise that you're going to have to make some decisions about your own future. The old rules are crumbling, the old certainties are dead. You're alive against all odds, and the world is waiting to see what you'll do with this strange gift of survival. And honestly, that's a pretty good place to be, all things considered. Terrifying, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But alive, and full of possibilities that your ancestors could never have dreamed of. The Black Death has ended, at least for now, and everything is about to change. You find yourself, in the weeks and months that follow, becoming something you never expected to be. A counter of the dead. Not officially, of course. There's no formal census bureau in medieval Europe, no government agency tasked with tracking population statistics. But someone has to figure out who's left, and in your village, that someone turns out to be you. Mostly because you can read a little and you survived, which puts you in a vanishingly small category of useful people. The local priest, not Father Bernard, who died in the second wave, but a replacement hastily sent from the diocese, a nervous young man who keeps blessing everything in sight, asks you to help him update the parish records. These records, kept in a heavy leather-bound book that smells of dust and incense, theoretically list every soul in the village. Births, marriages, deaths, baptisms, the whole cycle of human existence scratched out in Latin by generations of clergy. But when you open the book and start comparing names to faces you can actually find, the scale of what's happened begins to truly sink in. You work through the list systematically, name by name. John the Elder, who farmed the Northfield, dead. His wife Agnes, dead. Their son William, dead. Their daughter-in-law Margaret, alive, actually. You saw her yesterday. Looking dazed, but breathing. Their grandchildren, 2 dead, 1 alive, 1 missing and presumed dead. You make little marks next to each name, and the marks accumulate like falling leaves, page after page of mortality. The numbers you're compiling, multiplied across thousands of villages and towns throughout Europe, will eventually form the basis of one of history's grimmest calculations. Historians still argue whether the Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe's population, or closer to half, or in some regions as much as 60%. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, because medieval record-keeping was spotty even in the best of times, and these were emphatically not the best of times. Parish priests died before they could record their parishioners' deaths. Whole villages vanished without anyone left to document their passing. In some places, the dead were buried in such haste that no records were kept at all. But here's a quirky detail that might give you a sense of just how devastating this was. In the English county of Norfolk, a later survey found that approximately 45% of the clergy had died during the plague years. These were educated men, relatively well fed, living in better conditions than most peasants, and nearly half of them perished. If that was the death rate among the privileged classes, imagine what it was like for the poor, crowded together in unsanitary hovels, sharing beds and fleas and infection. You finish your count late in the evening, your candle guttering low, and you sit back to contemplate the numbers. Out of approximately 300 souls who lived in your village before the plague, you can confirm that about 120 are still alive. Another 30 or so are unaccounted for, fled to other places perhaps, or dead in ditches somewhere, their bodies never found. That leaves roughly half the village gone, transformed from living, breathing neighbours into entries in a death register, names that will fade from memory within a generation or two. The young priest looks at your figures and crosses himself, muttering prayers under his breath. He's been doing a lot of that lately. You suspect it's as much for his own comfort as for any spiritual efficacy, but you don't begrudge him the habit. Everyone's coping in their own way. Some people drink. There's more ale to go around now after all, with fewer mouths to consume it. Some people pray until their knees are raw. Some people simply stare into the middle distance, unable to fully process what they've witnessed. And some people, like you, count. There's something almost soothing about the numbers, about reducing the incomprehensible horror to neat columns and tallies. It gives the mind something concrete to hold on to when everything else feels like smoke. The counting isn't happening just in your village, of course. Across Europe, in manor houses and monasteries and municipal offices, survivors are attempting the same grim arithmetic. In Florence, the chronicler Giovanni Villani started recording the plague's progress before becoming a victim himself. His chronicle simply stops mid-sentence, a haunting monument to the disease's indifference. In Siena, the painter and writer Agnolo di Tura buried 5 of his own children with his own hands, and then wrote about it with a kind of stunned horror that still resonates across the centuries. The figures that emerge from these various attempts at counting paint a picture almost too vast to comprehend. Before the plague, Europe's population stood somewhere around 75 million people, give or take. After the first wave passed, that number had dropped to perhaps 50 million, and in some regions the losses were even more catastrophic. The Italian city-states, with their dense urban populations and active trade networks, were hit especially hard. Venice may have lost 60% of its people. Florence, that jewel of culture and commerce, saw its population cut roughly in half. You hear these reports from travellers who pass through your village, merchants trying to re-establish trade routes, pilgrims heading to shrines to give thanks for their survival, displaced persons wandering in search of somewhere that might feel like home. Their stories blur together after a while, a litany of death and devastation that spans from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the known world. And yet, within the horror, there are strange moments of dark humour that help the survivors cope. You hear about a town in Germany where the only person left alive was the village idiot, who spent days wandering the empty streets calling for people who would never answer. In another place, a dispute arose over inheritance because everyone who could have verified the claimant's identity was dead, leading to a farcical trial where the man essentially had to prove he was himself. A monastery in France reportedly had only one monk survive out of a community of 40. He lived alone in the vast echoing buildings for months, gradually going a little mad from the silence until other monks could be sent to join him. The counting continues for years, really, as communities slowly take stock of their losses. In England, the institution of the poll tax, a head tax on every adult, will eventually provide some of the most detailed population data from this period, though that particular innovation will later have consequences nobody anticipated. Tax records, manor rolls, guild registries, all these mundane administrative documents become windows into the catastrophe's scope. What the numbers reveal, beyond the raw death toll, is a fundamental restructuring of European society. The ratio of land to labour, which had defined medieval economics for centuries, has been violently inverted. Before the plague, there was never enough land for all the people who wanted to farm it. Peasants competed desperately for the right to work tiny plots, accepting whatever terms their lords dictated. Population pressure kept wages low and rents high. The average peasant lived on the edge of subsistence, one bad harvest away from starvation. But now you walk past field after empty field, good arable land lying fallow because there simply aren't enough hands to work it. The Lord Steward comes around asking, not demanding, asking, whether you might be willing to take on some additional acreage. He mentions, almost sheepishly, that he could offer you better terms than you currently have. Perhaps a reduction in the labour service you owe. Perhaps a slightly larger share of the harvest. This is unprecedented and you know it. Your grandfather would have laughed at the very idea of a lord negotiating with a peasant, but your grandfather is dead, along with most of his generation, and the rules that governed his world are dying too. You start to notice changes in the people around you, subtle shifts in posture and attitude. Old Marjorie, who spent her entire life bent in deference, has started looking people in the eye when she speaks to them. Young Thomas, who would have inherited nothing and spent his life as a landless labourer, is suddenly talking about opportunities. That word itself feels new, feels almost revolutionary. There are rumours of peasants in the next county over simply walking away from their manors, abandoning their legal obligations and heading to towns where no one knows their status, where they might be able to reinvent themselves as free workers. The authorities, of course, are trying to stuff the genie back in the bottle. You hear about laws being passed, harsh measures designed to freeze wages and prevent labourers from seeking better conditions. But how do you enforce such laws when half your enforcement mechanism is dead? How do you keep peasants tied to the land when there are 100 empty farms for every peasant willing to work one? You finish updating the parish records and hand them back to the nervous young priest, who files them away with trembling hands. He thanks you for your service and offers to pray for your continued health, which seems like a reasonable request given the circumstances. You step out of the church into the evening air, and you notice something you hadn't consciously registered before. Smoke rising from chimneys, here and there scattered across the village, signs of life, signs of people cooking their dinners, going about their business, stubbornly continuing to exist despite everything. The count is done, at least for now. Half your neighbours are dead, but half are alive. And that half, that battered, traumatised, utterly transformed half, is about to start building a new world on the ashes of the old. The numbers don't tell the whole story, of course. Numbers never do. But they provide a starting point, a baseline from which to measure everything that comes next. And what comes next, you're starting to realise, is going to be very interesting indeed. The spring twilight settles over your village like a soft blanket, and somewhere in the distance a dog is barking, probably at nothing, the way dogs do, but the sound is strangely comforting. It's a sound of normalcy, of ordinary life, of a world that keeps turning despite everything. You head home, your mind full of numbers and names and the strange arithmetic of survival, and you wonder what tomorrow will bring. The change comes to your doorstep on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a man you don't recognise wearing clothes slightly too fine for a common labourer. He introduces himself as a steward from an estate 3 villages over, and he has a proposition for you. His lord, it seems, has lost most of his workforce to the pestilence, and the spring planting is dangerously behind schedule. Would you perhaps consider coming to work his fields? He mentions a wage, an actual wage in silver pennies, that makes your eyes widen involuntarily. You've never been offered money for your labour before. The very concept feels almost transgressive, like something from a dream or a fever vision. Your entire life, you've worked under the customary arrangements of the manor. You owe your lord a certain number of days each week labouring on his domain, the land he keeps for himself, and in exchange you're allowed to farm your own strips in the common fields and live in your cottage without being thrown out. It's not slavery exactly, but it's not freedom either. It's just the way things have always been, as fixed and immutable as the seasons. But this stranger is offering you something different. He's offering you wages. He's treating your labour as something with a market value, something that can be bought and sold like wool or wheat. And the price he's quoting, well, it's roughly double what agricultural workers were earning before the plague, back when labour was cheap and plentiful. You tell him you'll think about it, which is itself a kind of revolution. A few years ago you wouldn't have dared to negotiate, to keep a lord's representative waiting while you considered your options. But the representative just nods, gives you his lord's name and location, and says he hopes to hear from you soon. Then he moves on to the next cottage, presumably to make the same offer to your neighbour. This scene is playing out across England, across France, across the whole of Western Europe. The massive die-off has created what economists would later call a tight labour market, and surviving workers are discovering that they suddenly have bargaining power. In some regions, wages have already doubled from their pre-plague levels. In others, they'll eventually triple. Peasants who spent their entire lives scraping by on subsistence farming are being offered actual money. Enough money to buy things, to save things, to imagine a future different from the grinding poverty of their past. The psychological impact of this shift is almost impossible to overstate. For generations, the European peasantry had internalized a certain vision of the world and their place in it. God had ordained 3 orders of society: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Peasants belonged to that 3rd category, and their role was to labour, to support the other orders, to accept their station with humble gratitude. The idea that their labour had a price, that they could negotiate terms, that they might refuse to work if the conditions weren't satisfactory, this was genuinely revolutionary thinking, even if nobody was using that word yet. You find yourself sitting in the village alehouse that evening, nursing a cup of weak beer and listening to the conversations swirling around you. Everyone's talking about the same thing: the offers that have been coming in, the wages being quoted, the opportunities that seem to be opening up. Old Robert, who's been farming the same strips his father farmed and his grandfather before that, is seriously considering moving to a town and learning a trade. Young Alice, whose husband died in the plague, has had 3 offers of remarriage in the past month, all from men eager to combine their holdings with hers, to create larger, more efficient farms. A travelling peddler who's been passing through shares news from other regions, and his tales are almost fantastical. In some parts of Germany, he says, peasants have been demanding written contracts guaranteeing their terms of employment. Written contracts, as if they were merchants or nobles conducting business. In parts of France, entire villages have collectively negotiated with their lords, presenting unified demands and refusing to work until those demands were met. And in England, he adds with a knowing wink, the authorities are getting nervous enough that there's talk of passing laws to control wages and restrict peasant movement. That last detail catches your attention because it suggests something important. The powerful are scared. They can see what's happening, the way the old order is fraying at the edges, and they're scrambling to maintain control. If wages were simply rising due to some natural economic adjustment, there'd be no need for laws to prevent it. The fact that legislation is being discussed means that someone up there recognises that the balance of power is shifting in ways that threaten their interests. You hear more specific rumours in the following days. Apparently in 1349, right in the middle of the plague's first wave, King Edward III of England issued an ordinance trying to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels. It was a desperate measure, an attempt to prevent the economic chaos that everyone could see coming, but enforcement was spotty at best during the crisis itself. Now, with the immediate danger past, there's talk of making this ordinance into a proper statute, with teeth, fines for workers who demand excessive wages, penalties for employers who pay them, a whole apparatus of enforcement designed to keep the peasantry in their place. Historians still argue whether these wage control measures were primarily about economics or about social control. On one hand, rising labour costs genuinely threatened the profitability of many estates, and there were legitimate concerns about inflation and economic disruption. On the other hand, there's something deeply revealing about a law that essentially tells working people they're not allowed to benefit from improved market conditions. The nobility and the merchant classes were perfectly happy to profit when circumstances favoured them. Why should workers be forbidden from doing the same? The reality on the ground, as you observe it, is that the laws are almost impossible to enforce consistently. Your village doesn't even have a proper court at the moment. The Lord's bailiff died in the plague, and his replacement hasn't been appointed yet. Who's going to prosecute you if you accept higher wages from that steward who came calling? Who's going to know? The old machinery of manorial justice, which kept peasants in line through a combination of custom, surveillance, and occasional violence, has been badly damaged. Too many of the overseers are dead. Too many of the records have been lost or abandoned. And so a shadow economy begins to emerge, a network of informal arrangements and under-the-table deals that exist in the gaps between law and reality. You hear about peasants who've negotiated secret wage agreements with employers desperate enough to pay above the legal maximum. You hear about workers who've simply left their manors, walking away from their legal obligations and disappearing into the anonymity of the towns. You hear about lords who've given up trying to enforce the old customs and have started offering competitive terms just to keep their estates functional. The black market in labour becomes, in its own quiet way, one of the most subversive forces in post-plague Europe. It's not organised, not revolutionary in any conscious sense. It's just thousands upon thousands of individual negotiations, each one a tiny rebellion against the established order. A peasant demanding an extra penny per day. A widow insisting on better terms before she'll remarry. A young man walking 10 miles to work for a lord who offers better conditions than his own. You make your decision on a rainy Thursday afternoon. You tell the steward from the distant estate that you'll come work his lord's fields, but only for the harvest season and only at the wage he quoted. You feel a flutter of anxiety as you say the words, some deep part of you still expecting divine punishment for such presumption. But no thunderbolt strikes. The steward just nods, shakes your hand, and tells you to report next Monday. Walking home through the rain, you feel something unfamiliar. A sense of agency, of control over your own destiny. It's probably an illusion. You're still a peasant, still at the mercy of weather and disease and the whims of the powerful. But for this moment, you made a choice. You negotiated terms. You treated your own labour as something valuable, something worth bargaining over. And that feels, in its small way, like the beginning of something new. The village is quiet in the rain, smoke rising from the surviving chimneys, puddles forming in the rutted lane. You pass the empty cottage where Thomas the tanner used to live, and for a moment you think you catch a whiff of that old familiar stench. But it's just your imagination, just memory playing tricks. Thomas is gone, and his trade with him, and the world has moved on in ways he never could have anticipated. You wonder what he'd think of all this, the wages, the negotiations, the strange new economy of survival. Probably he'd be confused, the way you're confused. Probably he'd be scared, the way you're scared. But maybe, just maybe, he'd also be a little bit hopeful. The rain picks up as you reach your cottage door, drumming steadily on the thatch above your head. Tomorrow you'll start preparing for your journey, gathering what few possessions you'll need for a season away from home. But tonight you'll sit by your fire and listen to the rain and think about the extraordinary thing that's happening all around you. The slow, halting, painful birth of a new kind of world. The document arrives in your village on a crisp autumn day in 1351, carried by a royal messenger who looks exhausted and slightly annoyed at having to travel to such a backwater. It's the Statute of Labourers, freshly enacted by Parliament, and the messenger reads it aloud in the village square to a small crowd of survivors who listen with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed fury. The statute's language is formal, legalistic, dense, with the kind of phrasing that makes your head hurt if you try to parse it too carefully. But the essence is simple enough. Wages are to be frozen at their pre-plague levels. Workers are forbidden from demanding or accepting higher pay. Employers who offer inflated wages will be fined. Labourers who refuse to work for the legally mandated rates will be punished. And, this is the part that makes people mutter angrily, able-bodied persons under the age of 60 who are without their own land or trade are required to work for whoever wants to hire them, at the old customary wages whether they like it or not. You stand near the back of the crowd, watching faces as the implications sink in. Old Marjorie, who just last month negotiated a tidy sum to help with the harvest at a neighbouring manor, looks like she's swallowed something sour. Young Thomas, who'd been talking so excitedly about opportunities and better terms, has gone very still and very quiet. The general mood is one of betrayed expectations. People had dared to hope that the new economic reality might actually benefit them, and now the authorities are trying to snatch that hope away. The messenger finishes his reading, rolls up the parchment and asks if there are any questions. Nobody speaks. What would be the point? The law is the law, handed down from King and Parliament, backed by the full weight of royal authority. Questioning it publicly would be foolish at best, dangerous at worst. So the villagers disperse in silence, each of them calculating privately how this new statute will affect their plans. But here's the thing about laws that try to fight against economic reality. They tend not to work very well. The Statute of Labourers looks impressive on parchment, but enforcing it across a depopulated kingdom proves to be an entirely different matter. The statute assumes a functioning judicial system, with courts and bailiffs and juries capable of investigating violations and imposing penalties. It assumes that employers will report workers who demand excessive wages, and that workers will report employers who offer them. It assumes, in short, a level of social cohesion and institutional capacity that the plague has severely damaged. In practice, what you observe over the following months is a kind of elaborate theatre of compliance. When officials are watching, everyone pretends to follow the rules. Wages are quoted at the legal maximums. Workers accept the mandated rates with appropriate humility. Everything looks proper and orderly, exactly as Parliament intended. But when officials aren't watching, which is most of the time given how few of them survived the plague, the real negotiations happen. You hear about a farmer in the next village who officially pays his workers the legal wage, but also provides them with generous gifts of food, clothing and housing that just happen to make up the difference. You hear about a lord who records the customary rate in his account books, but pays his labourers from a separate unrecorded fund. You hear about workers who accept the official wage, but then mysteriously find themselves assigned to lighter duties, given more breaks, treated with unusual consideration. The black market in labour, which was already developing before the statute, now becomes a fully established institution. It operates on winks and nods, on unspoken understandings, on the mutual recognition that everyone involved is technically breaking the law, and therefore everyone has an interest in keeping quiet about it. A strange solidarity develops between workers and the more pragmatic employers. They're all complicit in the same deception, all united against the distant authorities who don't understand how things actually work on the ground. You find yourself participating in this shadow economy, almost without meaning to. The steward who hired you for the harvest season pays you the official rate, as required by law, but he also invites you to take home whatever surplus vegetables you can carry, and he looks the other way when you help yourself to some of the windfall apples in the orchard. When you calculate the total value of what you're receiving, it comes out to significantly more than the legal wage. But nothing's written down, nothing's official, and if anyone asks, you're simply a loyal worker receiving lawful compensation plus the ordinary generosity of a kind employer. The courts do try to enforce the statute, to be fair. Records from this period show numerous prosecutions of workers who demanded excessive wages and employers who paid them. Fines were levied, examples were made, royal justices travelled the countryside hearing cases and delivering stern lectures about the importance of maintaining social order. Historians still argue whether these enforcement efforts were genuinely intended to control wages or whether they were primarily a source of revenue for a crown badly in need of funds. The fines, after all, went into royal coffers, and there was a certain financial incentive to find as many violations as possible. What the records also show, though, is that the prosecutions barely made a dent in the underlying reality. For every worker hauled before a court, Dozens more were quietly negotiating better terms and getting away with it. The statute created resentment, created fear, created a pervasive sense that the government was the enemy of working people, but it didn't actually freeze wages at pre-plague levels. The economic forces were simply too powerful, the labour shortage too severe, the opportunities for evasion too numerous. You witness one of these prosecutions firsthand in a market town about a day's walk from your village. A labourer named Richard has been accused of demanding 6p per day for harvest work when the legal maximum is 3p. The evidence against him is the testimony of a farmer who apparently got into an argument with Richard and decided to report him out of spite. Richard stands before the travelling justice, a pinch-faced man in expensive robes, and listens as his crime is read out. The justice lectures Richard at length about the proper order of society, about the duty of labourers to accept their station, about the wickedness of those who would exploit the kingdom's misfortune for personal gain. Richard stares at the ground throughout, his face carefully blank. He's fined 12p, 4 days' worth of the excessive wages he allegedly demanded, and warned that repeat offenders face imprisonment or worse. He pays the fine from a pouch at his belt, which suggests that despite everything, he's doing reasonably well for himself. Afterward, outside the courthouse, you happen to overhear Richard talking with some friends. He's annoyed about the fine, certainly, but he's not broken. The farmer who reported him, he says, is now on everyone's blacklist. No worker in the county will hire on with him, regardless of what he offers. And Richard himself will simply be more careful in the future, more discreet, more attentive to who might be listening when he discusses terms. The statute is a nuisance, he concludes, but it's not going to change the fundamental reality that there aren't enough workers and too much work. Walking home that evening, you think about the strange position the authorities have put themselves in. They've passed a law that they cannot effectively enforce, against economic forces they cannot control, and the primary result has been to make ordinary working people feel that the government is their adversary. The statute hasn't restored the old order, it's just added a layer of criminality to the new one. Every worker who negotiates a better wage is now, technically, a lawbreaker. Every employer who offers competitive terms is an accomplice. The entire economy is shot through with small illegalities, with deceptions and evasions, with a pervasive sense that the rules are unjust and therefore don't really need to be followed. This is fertile ground for something larger to grow, though you don't know it yet. The resentment building in villages like yours, the sense that the powerful are rigging the game against ordinary people, the experience of successfully defying authority and getting away with it. All of this is accumulating like kindling, waiting for a spark. It will take another 30 years for that spark to catch, for the simmering discontent to explode into open rebellion. But the foundations are being laid right now, in these quiet acts of resistance, in these whispered negotiations, in the growing conviction that the law serves the rich and oppresses the poor. For now, though, you just go about your business, doing what you need to do to survive and maybe even prosper in this strange new world. You accept the official wage and the unofficial bonuses. You keep your head down when the justices come around. You share information with other workers about which employers are fair and which are trouble. And slowly, imperceptibly, you and millions like you are reshaping European society, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through countless tiny choices, each one a small push against the old order. The autumn leaves are falling as you reach your village, carpeting the lane in gold and russet. The statute may be the law of the land, but the land itself seems indifferent to statutes, going about its eternal business of growth and decay regardless of what Parliament decrees. You find that thought oddly comforting as you settle in for the evening, the fire crackling in your hearth, the world outside growing dark and cold and quietly, stubbornly resistant to anyone's attempt to keep it frozen in place. You decide to visit your cousin in the next county over, a journey of about 2 days on foot, because you've heard rumours that his village has been abandoned entirely, and you want to see if he's all right. The path takes you through countryside you've known your whole life, past fields and woods and streams that should feel familiar and comforting. But nothing feels familiar anymore. The landscape itself has been transformed by absence. The first abandoned holding you pass looks almost normal at first glance. A cottage, a barn, a small paddock, the usual arrangement. But as you draw closer, you notice that the thatch is rotting, that weeds have invaded the vegetable garden, that the door hangs crooked on its hinges. No smoke rises from the chimney, no animals stir in the paddock. The place has the particular stillness of somewhere that's been empty for a while, that quiet sense of waiting for occupants who will never return. You peer through the door, more out of curiosity than any real purpose, and find the interior largely intact. Someone's possessions are still here. A wooden bowl on the table, a woolen blanket on the bed, a child's carved toy lying forgotten in a corner. The family didn't pack up and leave deliberately. They simply stopped being here, taken by the plague so quickly that their belongings remained frozen in place like a snapshot of ordinary life interrupted. This scene, you're discovering, is not unusual. As you continue your journey, you pass holding after holding in similar states of arrested decay. Some are completely empty, their occupants dead and buried, their lands reverting slowly to wilderness. Others show signs of recent visitation, scavengers perhaps, or opportunists checking for anything valuable left behind. A few have been tentatively occupied by new tenants, survivors from elsewhere looking to claim abandoned property, but these new arrivals seem thin on the ground. The phenomenon you're witnessing has a name, though you don't know it yet: the creation of deserted medieval villages. Across Europe, thousands of settlements are being abandoned in the plague's aftermath, some temporarily, many permanently. The pattern varies by region. In some areas, the remaining population consolidates into larger villages, leaving the smaller ones to crumble. In others, entire communities simply vanish, their locations forgotten until archaeologists rediscover them centuries later. In England alone, historians estimate that somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 villages were abandoned during and after the Black Death. Some of these were already struggling before the plague, marginal settlements on poor land that were only viable when population pressure was high. Others were perfectly functional communities that just happened to be hit especially hard by the disease, losing so many people that the survivors couldn't maintain the essential functions of village life. You reach your cousin's village by late afternoon of the second day, and your heart sinks as you approach. The church tower is visible from a distance, still standing, but the village clustered around it looks wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still. No dogs barking, no children playing, no sounds of daily life. You walk through what was once the main street and count the houses, perhaps 30 of them originally, now mostly empty. A handful show signs of occupation, thin trails of smoke, laundry hanging out to dry, the occasional face peering nervously from a window. But the overall impression is of a community that has collapsed below the threshold of viability. Your cousin, thank God, is among the survivors. You find him in his cottage, thinner than you remember, with a haunted look in his eyes that you're starting to recognise as the universal expression of plague survivors. He's glad to see you, genuinely glad, and he insists on sharing what little food he has while he tells you what happened. The plague hit this village harder than yours, he says. At the worst of it, they were burying 12 people a day, digging mass graves because there wasn't time or strength for individual burials. The priest died early, which meant the later victims went to their graves without last rites, a source of tremendous spiritual anxiety for the survivors, who worry about the fate of all those unshriven souls. By the time the dying stopped, nearly 2/3 of the village was gone, and then came the exodus. Those who could leave, did. The young and mobile headed for towns looking for opportunities in the skilled trades. Families with connections elsewhere went to stay with relatives, hoping to return eventually, but often never doing so. A few enterprising souls claimed abandoned holdings in better locations, consolidating their resources and moving on. What remains is a rump population of the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those with nowhere else to go. Your cousin isn't sure how long the village can survive in this diminished state. The lord of the manor, a minor nobleman who lived in a larger town some distance away, has shown no interest in the property since the plague. His steward died, his bailiff died, and apparently no replacements have been sent. The remaining tenants are in a strange legal limbo, technically bound to the land but effectively unsupervised, free to do as they please but lacking the resources to do much of anything. This is happening all over, your cousin says. Villages shrinking, merging, disappearing entirely. The landscape itself is being reorganised as survivors migrate toward better opportunities, leaving behind the marginal lands and struggling settlements that were only viable when there were too many people and not enough arable soil. It's a massive, uncoordinated resettlement, driven not by planning or policy, but by millions of individual decisions about where to live and how to survive. The ecological effects are already visible. You walk through forests that seem denser than you remember, woods that are reclaiming fields abandoned by farmers who are no longer there to work them. In some places you saw what were clearly once cultivated lands now reverting to scrub and woodland, the orderly strips of the common fields blurring back into wilderness. Nature, it turns out, doesn't wait for human permission to reassert itself. Historians still argue about the long-term environmental impact of the Black Death. Some contend that the massive reforestation of abandoned farmland actually caused a measurable drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide, enough to contribute to the period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. Others are sceptical of this claim, pointing to the difficulty of quantifying such effects with medieval evidence. But there's no question that the landscape of Europe was physically transformed by the plague's demographic catastrophe, that the neat patchwork of fields and villages gave way, in many places, to something wilder and less controlled. You spend the night at your cousin's cottage, sleeping uneasily on a straw pallet, dreaming of empty houses and overgrown gardens. In the morning, you help him with some repairs he's been putting off. The thatch needs attention, the fence around his small garden is falling down, the kind of maintenance that's difficult for one person to manage alone. The work feels good, feels normal, a brief return to the rhythms of ordinary life. Before you leave, your cousin walks you to the edge of the village and points toward the horizon. There used to be 3 other villages visible from this spot, he says. Now there's one, and even that one looks diminished. The others are ghost villages, empty shells, their inhabitants dead or scattered. Some of the buildings are still standing, he adds, and occasionally scavengers come through looking for useful materials, good timbers, iron fittings, anything that can be salvaged and reused elsewhere. You embrace your cousin and promise to visit again, though you both know how difficult travel remains and how uncertain everything is. Walking back through the depopulated countryside, you find yourself noticing the empty spaces more acutely than before. That stand of young trees. Was that once a field? That depression in the ground? Could that be the remains of a cottage foundation? The evidence of absence is everywhere, if you know how to look for it. Centuries from now, archaeologists will map these abandoned settlements using aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar, documenting the phantom outlines of villages that vanished in the plague years. They'll find the post holes of vanished buildings, the boundaries of forgotten fields, the traces of lives lived and lost in that terrible mid-14th century. The ghosts of these places will linger in the landscape long after everyone who remembers them is gone. For now, though, you just walk, putting one foot in front of the other on the rutted track, heading back toward your own village and your own life. The sun is warm on your face despite the autumn chill, and somewhere a bird is singing and the world goes on, diminished but not destroyed, emptier but not empty. You're alive, and your cousin is alive, and that will have to be enough for today. You notice it first in the church, on a Sunday morning when the reduced congregation gathers for Mass. The new priest, the nervous young one who replaced Father Bernard, is preaching about God's judgment, about the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, about the need for repentance and renewed faith. It's the same sermon you've heard 100 times before, the same theological framework that's supposed to make sense of catastrophe, but something has changed in how people are receiving it. Old Marjorie, who used to weep during sermons about hellfire and damnation, sits with her arms crossed and a sceptical expression on her face. Young Thomas, who once listened with rapt attention to every word from the pulpit, is visibly fidgeting, glancing toward the door as if calculating how soon he can leave. Even the more devout members of the congregation seem distracted, going through the motions of worship without the fervent intensity that characterized religious life before the plague. The priest senses it too. His voice wavers. He repeats himself. He grows louder, as if volume might substitute for conviction. But the harder he pushes, the more the congregation seems to withdraw into polite, distant compliance. They'll do what's expected of them, they'll kneel and pray and receive communion. But something essential has broken in the relationship between these people and their church. You understand because you feel it yourself. The theological explanation for the plague made a kind of sense in the abstract. God punishes sin, humanity is sinful, therefore humanity suffers. Simple enough. But you watch the plague kill good people and bad people with perfect indifference. You saw the most devout parishioners die in agony while notorious sinners recovered. You witnessed the priest, Father Bernard, a genuinely holy man by all accounts, succumb to the same disease that spared the village drunk. Whatever pattern of divine justice was supposed to be operating, you couldn't detect it. And you weren't alone in noticing. Across Europe, the plague has dealt a severe blow to the authority of the institutional church, not because people have stopped believing in God, but because the church's explanations have so spectacularly failed to match observable reality. The clergy promised that faith would protect the faithful. It didn't. They organised processions and prayers and masses for the dead. The dying continued. They assured people that the righteous had nothing to fear. The righteous died in droves. The numbers are devastating. In some regions, half the clergy perished, a higher mortality rate than the general population, probably because priests were expected to attend the dying and administer last rites, bringing them into close contact with the infected. Monasteries were hit especially hard, their communal living conditions perfect for spreading disease. Entire religious communities were wiped out, their accumulated wisdom and spiritual authority dying with them, and the replacements, when they came, were often inadequate. There simply weren't enough trained clergy to fill all the vacant positions, so the church relaxed its standards, ordaining men who would never have qualified before the plague. Your new priest is one of these emergency ordinations, barely educated, uncertain of doctrine, visibly uncomfortable with the weight of responsibility placed on his young shoulders. He does his best, but his best is a pale shadow of what Father Bernard offered. You hear stories from travellers about even worse situations elsewhere. Villages where the priest fled and never returned, leaving the community without anyone to perform the sacraments. Towns where the only available clergyman was a notorious drunk or a man of questionable character, appointed because he was literally the only candidate. Monasteries where discipline has collapsed, where the surviving monks have abandoned their vows and live like laymen, accumulating personal property and even taking wives. The church hierarchy naturally is concerned about this erosion of its authority. Bishops issue stern pronouncements about clerical standards. The Pope, safe in Avignon, having survived the plague in relative comfort, sends letters urging the faithful to remain steadfast. Reformers within the church push for renewed emphasis on education and discipline. But these efforts feel distant and abstract to people like you, who are dealing with the immediate reality of a religious institution that has manifestly failed to protect them. What rises in place of unquestioning faith is something more complicated, a kind of skeptical spirituality, still Christian in its basic framework but newly questioning of institutional authority. You still believe in God, still pray, still observe the major feasts and fasts, but you're more inclined now to trust your own spiritual intuitions, to seek a direct relationship with the divine rather than relying entirely on clerical intermediaries. The priest can perform the sacraments, can offer guidance, but he's no longer the unassailable authority he once seemed. This shift manifests in different ways for different people. Some turn to more intense personal devotion, spending hours in private prayer, acquiring devotional images and texts to create small domestic shrines. Others drift toward mysticism, seeking direct experience of God through contemplation and spiritual exercises. Still others become drawn to reformist movements that question the wealth and worldliness of the institutional church, calling for a return to apostolic simplicity. And some, more than the authorities would like to admit, simply lose faith altogether. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the quiet privacy of their hearts, they stop believing that the universe is governed by a just and loving God. The plague has shown them a world of random suffering, of meaningless death, of chaos and cruelty that resists any theological explanation. They go through the motions because social conformity requires it, but inwardly they have become skeptics, agnostics, perhaps even atheists in an age that has no vocabulary for such positions. Historians still argue about the long-term religious impact of the Black Death. Some see it as a crucial step toward the Reformation, which will fracture Western Christianity a century and a half later. Others emphasize the resilience of medieval faith, the way people found new forms of religious expression to cope with the trauma. What seems clear is that the easy, unquestioning acceptance of clerical authority was badly damaged, and something had to grow in its place. You see the alternatives emerging in your own village. A group of women has started meeting weekly to pray together, sharing their own interpretations of scripture without any priest present. A travelling preacher came through last month, denouncing the wealth of bishops and calling for Christians to live as the apostles lived, owning nothing, serving the poor. He drew a larger crowd than Sunday Mass typically attracts, and some of his ideas seem to have taken root. Several families have acquired illustrated prayer books, cheaper now because so many have been left behind by plague victims, and use them for household devotions that supplement rather than replace church attendance. The nervous young priest watches these developments with obvious anxiety. He's not sure what's permitted and what's heretical, what he should encourage and what he should condemn. His training, such as it was, didn't prepare him for a flock that questions rather than accepts, that seeks rather than simply receives. He muddles through as best he can, delivering his sermons to an increasingly distant congregation, performing the sacraments for people who receive them with less awe than before. Walking home from church on that Sunday morning, you find yourself thinking about Father Bernard. He was a good man, a wise man, a man whose faith seemed genuine and whose care for his parishioners was evident in everything he did. You trusted him in a way you don't quite trust his replacement. But even Father Bernard couldn't explain why the plague killed who it killed. Even he, in the end, was just a man trying to make sense of something senseless. Perhaps that's the lesson, if there is one. The Church is made of men, fallible men, and their authority ultimately rests on the trust of the people they serve. When that trust is broken, when the explanations fail and the promises prove empty, something fundamental shifts in the relationship. It doesn't disappear entirely. Religion is too deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life for that. But it changes, becomes more personal and more contested, less a matter of hierarchical decree and more a negotiation between individuals and their God. The sun is breaking through the clouds as you reach your cottage, casting long shadows across the lane. You pause for a moment to feel its warmth on your face, this simple physical pleasure that requires no theological justification. Then you go inside to prepare your midday meal, leaving questions of faith and doubt for another day. There's bread to eat and work to do, and the practical demands of survival, as always, take precedence over abstract contemplation. The procession comes through your village on a grey afternoon in early spring, and you step outside to watch along with everyone else, drawn by the strange sounds echoing down the lane. What you see makes you take an involuntary step backward, pressing yourself against the wall of your cottage as if mere distance could protect you from whatever this is. There are perhaps 30 of them, men and women both, stripped to the waist despite the chill, their backs crisscrossed with wounds both fresh and healing. They walk in a shuffling column, chanting in Latin, and at regular intervals they stop, fall to their knees, and begin to beat themselves with leather whips studded with metal points. The whips rise and fall in rhythm, blood spattering on the muddy ground, and the penitents cry out, whether in pain or ecstasy you genuinely cannot tell. These are the flagellants, and they represent one of the stranger responses to the plague's trauma. The movement emerged in Germany during the height of the epidemic, born from a conviction that the Black Death was God's punishment for human sin, and that only extreme penance could avert further divine wrath. Groups of devotees banded together, took vows to whip themselves publicly for 33 1/3 days, one day for each year of Christ's life, and travelled from town to town performing their bloody rituals. You've heard about them, of course. Everyone has heard about them, but hearing is one thing, witnessing is quite another. The reality of it, the raw wounds, the ecstatic faces, the strange mixture of horror and devotion, is more unsettling than any second-hand description could convey. You find yourself simultaneously repulsed and fascinated, unable to look away even as your stomach turns. The leader of the procession, a gaunt man with eyes that seem to look through you rather than at you, pauses near the village well and begins to preach. His voice is hoarse but carrying, and he speaks of the world's corruption, of the church's failure, of the need for true Christians to take salvation into their own hands. The clergy, he says, have proven themselves unworthy guides. Their prayers didn't stop the plague. Their sacraments didn't protect the faithful. Only direct physical penance can appease God's anger and prevent further catastrophe. The nervous young priest has emerged from the church and he watches the proceedings with an expression of pure panic. He knows he should probably intervene. The flagellants have been officially condemned by Pope Clement VI, their movement declared heretical, but he also knows he's badly outnumbered and the mood of the crowd is uncertain. Several villagers are listening to the preacher with apparent interest, nodding along with his denunciations of clerical corruption. The theology of the flagellants is a confused mixture of orthodox penitential practices and dangerous innovations. Self-mortification has a long history in Christian tradition. Monks and mystics have practiced various forms of physical discipline for centuries, But the flagellants have taken it to extremes, organised it into a mass movement, and most troublingly, begun to suggest that their rituals can substitute for the sacraments of the Church. Some flagellant groups claim that their blood, shed in imitation of Christ's suffering, has redemptive power, that participants can be cleansed of sin without confession, absolution, or priestly mediation. This is heresy, straightforwardly, and the Church's response has been swift and harsh in areas where its authority remains strong. In some regions, flagellants have been arrested, tried, and executed. In others, they've been forcibly dispersed, their leaders imprisoned. But enforcement is patchy, and in the chaos of the post-plague world, the movement has found room to flourish. Historians still argue about the total number of participants, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Europeans joined flagellant processions at the movement's height. What draws people to such extremity? You study the faces of the penitents kneeling in your village lane, whips raised, blood running down their backs, and you try to understand. Some of them look genuinely transported, lost in a kind of religious ecstasy that transcends physical pain. Others look grimly determined, as if performing a necessary duty regardless of personal suffering. A few, and this is perhaps most disturbing, look almost relieved, as if the external pain is somehow easier to bear than the internal anguish of grief and survivor's guilt. The psychological aftermath of the plague is something no one quite knows how to address. You've all witnessed horrors, lost people you loved, lived through experiences that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The normal mechanisms of processing grief, funerals, mourning periods, community support, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of death. Many people never got to properly say goodbye to their loved ones, never got to perform the rituals that bring closure. The trauma sits inside them, unprocessed, looking for an outlet. The flagellants offer one such outlet. The physical pain provides a focus for emotional suffering, a way of externalizing and expressing what might otherwise remain locked inside. The public performance creates a community of shared experience, a sense that others understand what you're going through, and the religious framework provides meaning. The suffering isn't random or pointless. It's a sacrifice, an offering, a participation in Christ's redemptive work. There's a quirky detail about flagellant groups that might surprise you. They were often highly organised, with elaborate rules and rituals governing every aspect of their processions. Members took oaths of obedience to their leaders. They were forbidden from speaking to outsiders without permission. They had specific chants for specific occasions, prescribed movements and gestures, a whole liturgy of suffering that gave structure to what might otherwise be mere chaos. In some ways, they resembled religious orders more than spontaneous movements, disciplined, hierarchical, bound by shared commitments. The procession in your village doesn't stay long. After perhaps an hour of preaching and self-flagellation, the leader signals for the group to move on. They have a schedule to keep, other villages to visit, a mission that won't wait. As they file out of the lane, still chanting, still bleeding, several villagers fall in behind them. You recognise young William, whose entire family died in the plague, and old Martha, who has spoken of nothing but sin and judgment since she recovered from a mild case of the disease. They're joining, drawn by whatever combination of guilt and grief and spiritual hunger has been building inside them. The priest watches them go with visible relief that the flagellants have departed, and visible anxiety about the parishioners who left with them. He'll have to report this to the bishop, he mutters to himself, though what the bishop will do about it is unclear. The church's enforcement mechanisms are stretched thin, and there are more pressing problems than a handful of peasants seeking extreme forms of penance. But the flagellants aren't the only fringe movement finding eager audiences in the post-plague world. You've heard about wandering preachers who announce that the end times are imminent, that the plague was the first of the apocalyptic plagues described in Revelation, that Christ's return is at hand. Some of these preachers attract followings of hundreds, even thousands, people willing to abandon their homes and lives in anticipation of the second coming. You've heard about mystics who claim direct communication with God, receiving visions and prophecies that bypass the institutional church entirely. Some are women, which is particularly unsettling to the authorities, since female religious authority has always been viewed with suspicion. These visionaries attract devoted followers, people hungry for spiritual certainty in an age when the old certainties have crumbled. You've heard about communities that reject worldly goods entirely, living in voluntary poverty, holding all things in common as the early Christians supposedly did. Some of these groups teeter on the edge of heresy, questioning doctrines that the Church considers settled. Others remain technically orthodox, but still represent a challenge to the comfortable, wealthy, hierarchical institution that medieval Christianity has become. What all these movements share is a sense that the old ways have failed, that the plague has revealed something fundamentally broken in the relationship between humanity and God, and that new approaches are needed. The institutional church, with its rituals and sacraments and hierarchies, didn't protect anyone from the pestilence. Perhaps these movements suggest salvation requires something different, something more personal, more extreme, more direct. The lane is quiet again, the flagellant's gone, the village settling back into its ordinary routines. But something lingers in the air, a sense of possibilities opened, of boundaries tested. The nervous young priest retreats to his church, probably to pray for guidance. You retreat to your cottage, probably to think about what you've witnessed. And somewhere on the road ahead, the procession continues its bloody journey, carrying its message of penance and purification to the next village, and the next, and the next. The rumours reach your village in fragments, whispered by travellers and carried by merchants whose routes take them through the German-speaking lands to the east. At first, you dismiss them as exaggerations, the kind of wild tales that circulate whenever people are frightened and looking for explanations. But the rumours keep coming, and they keep getting worse, and eventually you understand that something truly terrible is happening, something that makes even the plague itself seem almost impersonal by comparison. They're killing the Jews, not in isolated incidents, not in occasional outbursts of violence, but systematically, deliberately, in town after town across the Holy Roman Empire. The accusations are always the same. The Jews poisoned the wells, they caused the plague, they conspired to destroy Christendom by tainting the water supply with a deadly concoction of spiders, frogs, lizards, and the hearts of Christians. The confessions have been extracted under torture, the evidence manufactured or imagined, and the punishment is death, usually by burning, sometimes by other means equally horrific. You don't have Jews in your village, you've met a few in market towns, seen them in their distinctive clothing, perhaps exchanged a few words of commerce without really thinking about who they were or what their lives were like. They've always been somewhat mysterious figures to you, people who kept to themselves, who worshipped differently, who occupied a strange position in Christian society, tolerated but never fully accepted, useful for lending money and other economic functions that Christians were forbidden to perform, but always vulnerable when things went wrong, and things have gone very, very wrong. The wave of massacres that sweeps through the German lands in 1348 and 1349 represents one of the worst episodes of anti-Jewish violence in medieval history. Entire communities are annihilated. In Strasbourg, approximately 2,000 Jews are burned alive on a platform in the Jewish cemetery. In Mainz, the Jewish community, one of the oldest and most distinguished in Europe, is destroyed, its members killed or driven out. In hundreds of smaller towns, the pattern repeats: accusations, arrests, torture, confession, execution. The well poisoning accusation is, of course, completely false. Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, which should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The disease didn't check religious affiliation before striking, but logic has little power against fear, and the need to find someone to blame for incomprehensible catastrophe has led people to embrace explanations that they might otherwise have recognised as absurd. There's a darker layer to the violence as well, one that has less to do with plague theories and more to do with economics. Many of the Jews killed were creditors, people who had loaned money to Christians who are now quite happy to see their debts literally go up in smoke. Some of the most enthusiastic participants in the massacres were people who owed substantial sums to Jewish lenders. When the Jews were killed and their property confiscated, those debts conveniently disappeared. Historians still argue about the relative weight of different factors in driving the violence. Religious hatred, certainly. Centuries of Christian teaching about Jewish responsibility for Christ's death had created a reservoir of hostility that could be tapped in times of crisis. Economic resentment. The perception that Jews had grown wealthy through usury, even though Christians had pushed them into that role by forbidding them from most other professions. Political opportunism. Some local authorities used the chaos as cover to seize Jewish property or eliminate economic competitors. And sheer psychological displacement. The overwhelming trauma of the plague needed an outlet, and scapegoating provided one. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, condemned the massacres and pointed out the obvious flaw in the well-poisoning theory. Jews were dying of the plague too. He issued a papal bull forbidding Christians from killing Jews without legal process, and threatening those who did with excommunication. But papal authority had limited reach in the chaotic conditions of plague-stricken Europe, and many local authorities ignored or defied his instructions. Some secular rulers also tried to protect their Jewish subjects, though often for pragmatic rather than humanitarian reasons. Jews were valuable. They paid taxes, they provided financial services, they contributed to the economy. Killing them was bad for business. Duke Albert of Austria sheltered Jews in his territories and punished those who attacked them. Some bishops and city councils did the same. But these pockets of protection were islands in a sea of violence, and even protected communities often faced pressure to convert or leave. The scale of destruction is difficult to comprehend. Perhaps a third of all Jews living in German-speaking lands were killed during the plague years. Hundreds of communities that had existed for generations were wiped out entirely. The survivors fled eastward, many of them settling in Poland and Lithuania, where they would rebuild their communities and flourish for centuries, until another, even more catastrophic persecution descended upon their descendants in the 20th century. You hear these stories in your village sitting by the fire in the alehouse, and you feel something you can't quite name. Horror, certainly. These are human beings being burned alive, tortured, murdered for crimes they didn't commit. But also a kind of uneasy self-examination. You've never done violence to a Jew, never participated in a pogrom, but have you harboured the same suspicions, believed the same stereotypes, accepted the same casual prejudices that make such violence possible? The line between passive prejudice and active persecution seems thinner and more permeable than you'd like to admit. A merchant who's travelled through the affected regions describes what he saw, and his account is delivered in the flat, careful tone of someone who doesn't want to remember, but can't quite forget. The smell, he says, that's what stays with you. Burning flesh has a particular smell, and when you've burned hundreds of people, men, women, children, the elderly, the smoke hangs over the town for days. He saw the platform in Strasbourg where the execution took place, the ashes still visible, the ground still scorched. He saw the empty houses in the Jewish quarter, already being looted by Christian neighbours eager to claim what the dead no longer needed. The bizarre accusation about well poisoning has a strange afterlife. Confessions extracted under torture are recorded, preserved, copied and distributed as proof of Jewish malevolence. These documents become part of the anti-Semitic archive, cited for centuries as evidence of Jewish conspiracy. The fact that the confessions were obtained through agony and terror, that people will say anything to stop the pain, seems to matter not at all to those who want to believe the worst. There's a quirky and disturbing detail about the confessions that historians have noted. They're oddly specific about the ingredients of the supposed poison. Spiderwebs, frog legs, lizard tails, the hearts of unbaptized children. The lists read almost like recipes, as if someone sat down and invented the most disgusting concoction they could imagine. Some scholars suggest that the confessors were simply telling their torturers what they wanted to hear, filling in blanks in the accusation with whatever horrifying details seemed likely to satisfy their interrogators. You think about your own limited encounters with Jews, the money changer in the market town who converted your few coins at a fair rate, the old man with the long beard who sold fabric of surprisingly good quality, and you try to reconcile those mundane memories with the monstrous conspiracy you're now supposed to believe in. It doesn't fit. None of it fits. But you're also aware that your skepticism puts you in a minority, that most people seem willing to accept the accusations, that the violence has happened and continues to happen, despite papal condemnation and rational objection. The consequences of the massacres will reshape Jewish life in Europe for centuries. The centre of gravity shifts eastward, away from the German lands toward Poland and Lithuania. Jewish communities become more insular, more wary, more conscious of their vulnerability. The memory of 1348 to 1349 becomes part of Jewish collective memory, a reminder that in times of crisis, they will always be at risk. And for Christian Europe, the massacres leave a different kind of legacy, a precedent, a template, a demonstration of how easily scapegoating can escalate into mass murder. The techniques used against Jews during the plague will be refined and repeated in later centuries, applied to other marginalised groups, eventually systematised into something even more horrific than the medieval mobs could have imagined. Night has fallen while you've been listening to these stories, and the fire in the alehouse has burned low. You drain the last of your ale and step out into the dark lane, heading home with a heaviness in your chest that has nothing to do with drink. The stars are bright overhead, indifferent to human cruelty, and somewhere far to the east the ashes of burned communities are being scattered by the wind. You don't know what to do with this knowledge, how to carry it, what it means for your understanding of the world and the people in it. You only know that something has been revealed about the depths to which frightened people can sink, and you're not sure you'll ever see your fellow Christians quite the same way again. The physician arrives in your village on a mule, his saddlebags stuffed with strange implements and stranger medicines, and he sets up shop in a cottage that's been empty since its previous occupant died in the second wave. He's not the kind of doctor you're used to, not a university-trained man who quotes Galen and Hippocrates, but something humbler and more practical, a barber surgeon who's learned his trade through apprenticeship and experience. Still, he's the first medical practitioner you've seen since the plague began, and people are cautiously curious. You watch from a distance as he examines his first patient, old Edmund, whose leg wound has refused to heal properly despite weeks of prayer and poultices. The physician looks at the wound, smells it, prods it gently with a clean stick, and frowns. Then he does something unexpected. He washes his hands in vinegar before touching the patient directly, and he insists that Edmund's wife boil clean cloths before they are used as bandages. These precautions seem odd to you. What do clean hands and boiled cloths have to do with healing? But the physician explains patiently that he's observed something during his years of treating wounds and fevers. Patients whose wounds are kept clean seem to recover more often than those whose wounds are left dirty. Physicians who wash between patients seem to spread less sickness. He can't explain why. He readily admits his ignorance on the theoretical level, but the pattern has been consistent enough that he now follows it as a matter of course. This is medicine in the aftermath of the Black Death. Hesitant, experimental, groping toward insights that won't be properly understood for another 5 centuries. The plague has shattered the confidence of the medical profession such as it was. The university physicians with their elaborate theories, the ones who blamed bad air, planetary alignments, corrupted humours, were proven spectacularly wrong. Their treatments didn't work. Their predictions didn't hold. Their authority, like that of the Church, has been badly damaged by the catastrophe. The traditional medical framework, inherited from ancient Greek and Arabic sources, held that health depended on the balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease occurred when these humours fell out of balance, and treatment consisted of restoring equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustments, and other interventions designed to remove excess humours or replenish deficient ones. It was an elegant theory, internally consistent and almost entirely useless against the plague. Physicians tried everything. They prescribed theriac, a complex concoction of dozens of ingredients including opium and viper flesh, believed to be a universal antidote. They recommended fleeing infected areas, which actually did work, not because of any medical virtue, but simply because distance reduced exposure. They advised avoiding bathing, on the theory that open pores allowed bad air to enter the body, which was wrong but not entirely unreasonable given their understanding of disease transmission. They suggested burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, which made rooms smell better, but did nothing to stop the spread. The honest physicians, and there were some, admitted that they had no idea what caused the plague or how to cure it. Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to Pope Clement VI, and one of the most respected medical authorities of the age, contracted the plague himself and survived. He wrote frankly about the disease's mysterious nature, acknowledging that it defied all the categories of traditional medicine. Historians still argue about whether his survival gave him special credibility, or whether it just made him lucky. What emerged from the plague, gradually and uncertainly, was a new willingness to experiment, to observe, to prioritise practical results over theoretical consistency. The physician in your village is part of this shift. He doesn't quote Aristotle or debate the finer points of humoral theory. He watches what happens. He keeps mental notes about which treatments seem to help and which don't. He washes his hands in vinegar because he's noticed that it seems to make a difference, even though he can't explain the mechanism. This empirical approach will eventually revolutionise medicine, though the process will take centuries and involve countless dead ends and false starts. For now, it coexists uneasily with the older traditions. University physicians still teach humoral theory, still bleed their patients, still prescribe elaborate herbal compounds based on ancient recipes. But alongside them, a new breed of practitioner is emerging, humbler, more practical, more willing to admit ignorance and try new things. The barber surgeon treats old Edmund's leg wound with a poultice of honey and bread mould, another practice he's observed to be helpful without understanding why. He recommends that Edmund keep the wound clean and dry, change the bandages regularly, and eat nourishing food to build his strength. It's not sophisticated medicine by any standard, but it's attentive and careful, and over the following weeks, Edmund's wound actually begins to heal. There's a quirky detail about post-plague medicine that might interest you. The profession began to keep much better records. Before the Black Death, medical observation was largely anecdotal, passed down through apprenticeship and rarely written down systematically. But the plague's devastation prompted some physicians to start documenting what they saw, the symptoms, the progression, the treatments tried, and their results. These plague treatises, as they came to be called, represent an early form of medical literature focused on observation rather than theory. The most famous of these treatises describe the plague in vivid clinical detail: the buboes, the fever, the black spots on the skin that gave the disease its name. They record the terrifying speed of progression, the way patients could seem healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. They note the high mortality among caregivers, which suggested something about how the disease spread, even if no one could identify the actual mechanism. And they honestly admit the failure of standard treatments, the helplessness of physicians confronting something they didn't understand. You visit the barber surgeon yourself eventually, to have him look at a persistent cough that's been bothering you for weeks. He examines you carefully, asks questions about your symptoms, listens to your chest with his ear pressed against your back. Then he tells you it's probably nothing serious, likely just the lingering effects of a winter cold, but that you should drink warm broth, rest when you can, and avoid cold draughts. He doesn't bleed you, doesn't purge you, doesn't prescribe expensive medicines you couldn't afford anyway. Walking home, you reflect on how different this was from your previous encounters with medical care. The old physician who used to visit the manor, before he died in the plague, of course, was full of Latin terms and complicated explanations, confident in his theories even when his treatments failed. This new man is different. He admits what he doesn't know. He focuses on practical advice. He seems genuinely interested in whether his patients improve rather than in defending his professional dignity. The shift in medical thinking will have implications far beyond disease treatment. The willingness to question received wisdom, to prioritize observation over authority, to admit ignorance and experiment with new approaches. These habits of mind will eventually contribute to what historians call the scientific revolution. It won't happen overnight. There will be centuries of false starts and wrong turns, of charlatans and quacks alongside genuine investigators. But something has changed in the relationship between humans and their understanding of the natural world. The plague has taught a hard lesson. The old authorities, in medicine as in religion, didn't have all the answers. Their theories, however elegant and ancient, couldn't explain the catastrophe or prevent it. If progress is to be made, it will have to come through new methods, through observation, experimentation, willingness to discard ideas that don't match reality. The barber surgeon washing his hands in vinegar doesn't know he's participating in a revolution of human thought. He just knows that it seems to help, and for now, that's enough. The sun is setting as you reach your cottage, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Your cough is still there, a faint tickle at the back of your throat, but it doesn't seem worth worrying about. You've survived the plague. You've survived the aftermath. A cough is nothing, a minor annoyance in a world that has shown you what real suffering looks like. You prepare your evening meal, simple fare eaten alone in your quiet cottage, and you think about the strange new world that's taking shape around you. A world where old certainties are crumbling and new possibilities are beginning, tentatively, to emerge. You see the painting in the church, unveiled on a feast day when the congregation gathers to celebrate one of the few genuinely happy occasions since the plague receded. The nervous young priest has commissioned it from a travelling artist, partly to beautify the sanctuary and partly, you suspect, to give people something to think about other than their losses. But when the cloth is pulled away and the painting revealed, you realise that the artist has created something very different from the gentle Madonnas and serene saints that decorated churches before the catastrophe. The painting shows a dance. That's your first impression. figures moving together in some kind of procession or celebration. But as your eyes adjust to the dim candlelight, the details become clearer and the celebration turns into something else entirely. The dancers are paired: a king with a skeleton, a bishop with a skeleton, a merchant with a skeleton, a peasant with a skeleton. Death, grinning with empty eye sockets, leads each of them by the hand, and they follow whether they want to or not. The dance of death, the artist calls it, and you stand before it for a long time, unable to look away. This is the new art of the post-plague world, and it's everywhere. The cheerful, confident imagery that characterized religious art before the Black Death. The triumphant Christ, the benevolent Virgin, the peaceful saints resting in eternal glory, has given way to something darker, more anxious, more obsessed with mortality and decay. Skeletons grin from church walls. Corpses in various stages of decomposition remind the living of what awaits them. The message is repeated again and again, in Latin and in vernacular languages, carved in stone and painted on wood, memento mori. Remember that you will die. You find the images disturbing, and you're not alone. Several of the older villagers mutter disapprovingly about the painting, complaining that churches should be places of hope and comfort, not reminders of death. But the younger people seem drawn to the imagery in ways they can't quite articulate. Perhaps it feels honest to them. Perhaps after what they've witnessed, the older art seems naive, even dishonest. A pretense that death is distant and manageable, rather than the overwhelming reality that swept through every village and took whoever it wanted. The psychological function of this morbid art is something historians still argue about. One interpretation sees it as a kind of collective therapy, a way of processing trauma by confronting it directly rather than avoiding it. By depicting death in stylized, almost ritualistic form, artists and their audiences could acknowledge what had happened without being overwhelmed by it. The skeleton becomes almost a familiar figure, a character in an ongoing drama rather than the terrifying abstraction that stalked the plague years. Another interpretation emphasizes the social leveling implicit in the dance of death imagery. Notice who's dancing: kings and bishops, merchants and peasants, rich and poor alike. Death makes no distinctions. The plague killed across all classes, took the powerful as readily as the powerless, rendered earthly status meaningless. There's something almost democratic about these images, a reminder that whatever hierarchies human beings construct, the grave awaits everyone equally. The art of this period displays a fascination with bodily decay that can seem morbid to modern eyes. Tombs begin to feature transy sculptures, effigies that show the deceased not in peaceful repose but in active decomposition, flesh rotting, worms crawling, the body returning to dust. These images were meant to inspire humility and piety, to remind the living that physical beauty and worldly success are temporary, that the soul's fate is what truly matters. But they also reflect a generation that has seen too much death to pretend it's clean or dignified. You hear about a particularly striking example from a cathedral in another region, a tomb that shows the deceased twice, on 2 levels. On top, the person is depicted as they appeared in life, well-dressed, peaceful, hands folded in prayer. Below, visible through an opening in the lower level, the same person is shown as a decaying corpse, the contrast designed to shock viewers into contemplating their own mortality. The effect, according to those who've seen it, is unforgettable. The quirky detail that catches your attention is how quickly these new artistic conventions spread. Within a few decades of the plague, the dance of death imagery appears in churches and public buildings across Europe, from England to Poland, from Italy to Scandinavia. Artists copy and adapt the basic concept, adding local details and variations, but the core theme remains consistent. Death dances with everyone. Death comes for everyone. Death is the great equalizer that no earthly power can resist. But the post-plague art isn't entirely focused on death and decay. There's another strand that emphasizes the pleasures of earthly life, the beauty of the physical world, the importance of enjoying what time you have. This strand will eventually flower into the Renaissance celebration of human achievement and natural beauty, but even now, in the immediate aftermath of the plague, you can see it emerging. Some artists are painting with new attention to realistic detail, capturing the textures of fabric and flesh, the play of light on surfaces, the individual features of human faces. This tension, between morbid preoccupation with death and heightened appreciation of life, defines the cultural moment you're living through. People who have witnessed mass mortality seem to respond in one of two directions. Either they become obsessed with death, constantly reminding themselves of its inevitability, or they become determined to seize whatever pleasure and beauty life offers while it lasts. Many seem to oscillate between these poles, pious and penitent one moment, hedonistic and worldly the next. You notice this pattern in your own village. Old Marjorie, who once embodied steady, unquestioning piety, now alternates between intense religious devotion and surprising moments of earthy pleasure, sharing bawdy jokes at the alehouse, wearing a bright ribbon in her hair, insisting on small treats and comforts that she never would have allowed herself before. Young Thomas, who survived when his entire family perished, swings between black moods when he can barely speak, and manic periods when he seems determined to experience everything life has to offer before death catches up with him. The art reflects this duality. Next to the Dance of Death painting in your church, the artist has added a smaller panel showing the Garden of Eden before the fall, lush, beautiful, overflowing with fruits and flowers and innocent pleasure. The juxtaposition seems intentional. Here is what we lost, here is what awaits us. Between paradise past and grave future, we have only the present moment, and we must make of it what we can. Walking home from the unveiling ceremony, you find yourself thinking about your own mortality in ways you never did before the plague. When you were younger, death was an abstraction, something that happened to old people and the unlucky, something distant enough that you didn't need to think about it much. But you've held the hands of the dying now. You've helped bury bodies in mass graves. You've watched the life leave the eyes of people you loved. Death is no longer abstract. It's intimate, familiar, present in a way it never was before. The memento mori imagery speaks to this new familiarity. It acknowledges what you know in your bones, that death can come at any time, without warning, without regard for your plans or hopes or prayers. But it also suggests a kind of liberation. If death is certain and its timing unpredictable, then perhaps the elaborate concerns that occupied you before the plague, social status, accumulated wealth, earthly reputation, matter less than you thought. Perhaps what matters is how you live each day, how you treat the people around you, what moments of beauty and connection you create in the time you have. You pause outside your cottage, looking up at the evening sky streaked with the last colours of sunset. A blackbird is singing somewhere nearby, its song impossibly sweet against the darkening air. You stand there for a long moment, letting the beauty of it wash over you, feeling the strange mixture of grief and gratitude that has become your constant companion. The world is full of death, yes. The church walls are covered with dancing skeletons and rotting corpses, yes. But the world is also full of blackbird songs and painted sunsets and moments of unexpected grace. You go inside, light your candle, prepare for sleep. Tomorrow the art will still be there, the skeletons still dancing, the reminders of mortality still pressing their message. But tonight, you're alive, and that's something worth noticing. The memento mori artist would approve, you think. They're not trying to make you despair. They're trying to make you pay attention, to recognize the preciousness of what you have while you have it. Remember that you will die. Yes, but also remember that right now, in this moment, you are living. You see him at the market, and at first you don't recognize him. It's John, the son of the miller who died in the plague. The same John who used to wear rough homespun and keep his eyes downcast when speaking to his betters. But this John is wearing a scarlet tunic embroidered with gold thread, leather boots that reach nearly to his knees, and a hat with a feather in it that would have been absurd on a miller's son just a few years ago. He catches your eye, grins with something between pride and embarrassment, and shrugs as if to say, I know, I know. The transformation isn't unique to John. All around the market you see peasants and common labourers dressed in fabrics and colours that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Bright blues and deep greens, fine wool and even touches of silk, belts with metal buckles, caps and hoods in the latest styles. The old visual hierarchy that let you identify someone's station at a glance has become confused, blurred, almost unreadable. A stranger entering this market wouldn't be able to tell the baker's wife from a minor noblewoman, and that's precisely the point. This sartorial rebellion has been building since the dying stopped, fueled by the same economic forces that have driven up wages. Workers with more money in their pockets are spending it on things that were previously beyond their reach. and clothing is one of the most visible and satisfying ways to display newfound prosperity. The wool merchant's stall is busy with customers who would never have been able to afford his finer fabrics before. The tailor has more work than he can handle, commissioned to make garments in styles copied from the nobility. The authorities, predictably, are not pleased. Sumptuary laws, regulations governing who can wear what, have existed for centuries, designed to maintain visible distinctions between social classes. Commoners aren't supposed to wear certain fabrics, certain colours, certain accessories. These restrictions served both practical and symbolic purposes. They limited the market for luxury goods, which were often imported and expensive, and they ensured that social rank remained immediately legible to anyone with eyes. But the post-plague world is making a mockery of these laws. You've heard about the English Statute of 1363, which attempted to codify clothing restrictions in exhaustive detail. Esquires and gentlemen worth less than £100 per year are forbidden from wearing gold or silver or jewelled embroidery. Servants and labourers are restricted to coarse cloth worth no more than 12 pence per yard. Women's veils must be proportional to their husband's income. The regulations go on, a desperate attempt to freeze the visual markers of hierarchy in place. The problem is enforcement. How do you police what everyone in the kingdom is wearing? The courts are already overwhelmed with labour law violations. Adding clothing crimes to the docket would be absurd, and even when cases are brought, the penalties are often minor enough that wealthier commoners simply pay the fines and continue dressing as they please. The fines become, in effect, just another cost of upward display, a tax on social climbing that the newly prosperous are willing to bear. John, the miller's son, explains his wardrobe choices to you over a mug of ale. He inherited his father's mill, which would have been enough to explain a modest improvement in his circumstances, but he's also been taking advantage of the labour shortage, hiring workers at competitive wages and expanding his operation to serve multiple villages. The profits have been substantial, and he sees no reason to dress like a poor man when he's no longer poor. There's defiance in his voice when he talks about it, a chip-on-the-shoulder quality that suggests he's not just enjoying his new clothes but making a point with them. All his life, he says, he was told to know his place, to accept his station, to understand that the natural order put people like him at the bottom. The plague didn't respect that order. The plague killed lords and peasants alike, priests and sinners, the high and the low. If death doesn't recognise social distinctions, why should clothing? You nod along, understanding the sentiment even if you're not entirely comfortable with its implications. The old order was oppressive, certainly, but it was also stable, predictable, known. This new world of blurred boundaries and shifting status feels chaotic, unsettled, almost dangerous. If anyone can dress like a gentleman, what does it mean to be a gentleman? If the external markers of rank lose their meaning, what happens to the internal hierarchies they represented? The quirky detail that sticks with you is the specific items that have become fashionable among the newly prosperous. Pointed shoes called poulaines are particularly popular. The longer and more extravagantly pointed, the better. Some men are wearing shoes with points so extended they have to be tied to their knees with chains to allow walking. It's ridiculous, impractical, and utterly delightful to the people wearing them. The very absurdity is part of the appeal. They're wearing shoes that serve no functional purpose, shoes that actually impede movement, because they can, because for the first time in their lives, they have the money and the freedom to indulge in frivolous display. Women's fashion has shifted too, though the changes are more subtle. Necklines have dropped, waistlines have moved. Headdresses have become more elaborate, with veils and wimples giving way to structures of wire and fabric that frame the face and display the hair. These styles were originally the province of noblewomen, adopted by bourgeois women with pretensions, and now filtering down to anyone with coins enough to pay for them. The visual vocabulary of female beauty is being democratized, or at least commercialized, in ways that unsettle traditionalists. The moralists are naturally outraged. Sermons thunder against the sin of pride, against the wickedness of dressing above one's station, against the vanity that leads people to care more about their appearance than their souls. The preachers see in these sartorial changes all the evidence they need that the plague has loosened moral restraints, that survivors are abandoning the virtues of humility and modesty in favour of worldly display. They predict divine punishment for such presumption. Another plague, perhaps, or some other catastrophe sent to humble the arrogant. But the fancy clothes keep selling, and the people keep buying them, and the visual landscape of Europe keeps shifting towards something more colourful, more varied, More confusing than anything that came before. You walk through the market and you genuinely cannot tell, in some cases, who outranks whom. The old queues are unreliable. You have to actually talk to people, ask questions, observe their behaviour, rather than simply reading their status from their appearance. Historians still argue about the long-term significance of this post-plague fashion revolution. Some see it as a genuine democratisation of consumption, a breakdown of rigid hierarchies that would eventually contribute to more fluid, merit-based social structures. Others emphasise the limits. The nobility and gentry maintain distinctions through ever more elaborate displays, always staying one step ahead of the commoners trying to emulate them. The game of status through clothing didn't end. It just became more competitive, more expensive, more rapidly changing. What you sense, without having the vocabulary to articulate it, is that something has shifted in how people relate to their social positions. Before the plague, your station was given, assigned by birth, reinforced by law and custom, accepted as part of the natural order. After the plague, station feels more like something you perform, something you construct through choices about how to dress, where to work, how to carry yourself. It's still constrained, still shaped by forces beyond individual control, but the constraints have loosened, and the spaces for self-fashioning have widened. John finishes his ale and stands to leave, adjusting his ridiculous feathered hat with evident satisfaction. He's not just a miller's son anymore, not in his own mind. He's a prosperous businessman, a man of means, someone worthy of fine clothes and respect. The scarlet tunic and the gold embroidery are his declaration of this new identity, his visible argument against the old order that would have kept him in rough homespun forever. You watch him go, this transformed figure who used to be just John, and you wonder what your own clothes say about you. They're better than they were before the plague. You've benefited from higher wages too, can afford fabric you couldn't have touched before. But you haven't made the leap John has made, haven't embraced the new possibilities with his abandon. Perhaps you're too cautious. Perhaps you're waiting to see how it all shakes out, whether the authorities will crack down, whether this bubble of prosperity will last. The market continues around you, a swirl of colours and fabrics and competing displays. Someone is selling ribbons in shades you've never seen before, imported from somewhere exotic. Someone else has leather gloves for sale, soft and fine, the kind nobility used to hunt with. The old world is dying, dressed in sober browns and greys. The new world is emerging, gaudy and uncertain, in scarlet and gold. The news arrives on a cold autumn afternoon, carried by a breathless messenger who's been riding for days. Your lord, or rather, the distant cousin who inherited the manor when the original family died in the plague, has himself succumbed to a fever. Not the plague this time, just an ordinary illness that carried him off before anyone realised how serious it was. He leaves behind no direct heir, only a tangle of competing claims that will take years to sort out. You stand with the other villagers in the manor courtyard, listening as the steward explains what this means for the estate. The short answer is, nobody knows. There are at least 3 people who might have legitimate claims to the property, each represented by lawyers who will argue and counter-argue until the matter is decided by some distant court. In the meantime, the steward will continue to manage daily operations, collect rents, maintain order. But the fundamental question of who actually owns this land, and therefore who owns the obligations of everyone living on it, remains unresolved. This scene, multiplied across thousands of estates throughout Europe, represents one of the stranger consequences of the Black Death, a vast, chaotic reshuffling of property and inheritance that will take generations to fully settle. The plague killed so quickly and so indiscriminately that normal inheritance patterns were shattered. Families that had held land for centuries saw their lines extinguished in a matter of weeks. Estates passed to distant relatives who had never expected to inherit anything, who sometimes didn't even know the deceased, who occasionally couldn't be located at all. The legal system is overwhelmed. Courts that normally processed a steady trickle of inheritance disputes are now drowning in cases, each one complicated by the same factors: missing documents, dead witnesses, uncertain relationships, competing claims. Lawyers are doing well. They're always doing well in times of chaos. But even they struggle to untangle the knotted threads of post-plague succession. You hear stories that would be comic if they weren't so consequential. In one case, a man claims an estate based on his marriage to a woman who was the niece of the deceased lord's first wife's sister. The claim requires proving a chain of relationships stretching across 4 families, several of whom left no surviving members to testify. In another case, two brothers both claim the same property, each insisting the other died first in the plague, each producing witnesses who support their version. The courts eventually decide the matter by examining which brother's witnesses are more credible. A judgment that seems almost arbitrary given the circumstances. The inheritance chaos creates opportunities for the cunning and the unscrupulous. You've heard about people who simply moved onto abandoned estates and claimed them, betting that no legitimate heir would emerge to challenge them. In some cases they were right. The true heirs were dead, or couldn't be found, or lacked the resources to pursue legal action. In other cases they were eventually evicted, but only after years of occupation that made the eviction feel like an injustice. The line between legitimate inheritance and opportunistic seizure has become disturbingly blurred. Women, surprisingly, sometimes benefit from this confusion. Under normal circumstances, inheritance favoured male heirs, with women receiving dower rights or smaller shares. But when all the male heirs are dead, the rules become more flexible. Widows find themselves in control of estates they would never have managed otherwise. Daughters inherit when there are no sons. Even distant female relatives sometimes emerge as the only surviving claimants to substantial properties. You know a woman in the next village, Margaret, whose story illustrates the pattern. Before the plague, she was the wife of a moderately prosperous farmer, with no expectation of inheriting anything significant. Her husband's family was large and healthy, with multiple brothers and sons who stood in line before any property would reach her. But the plague took them all, husband, brothers-in-law, nephews, the entire male line of the family, and left Margaret as the sole survivor with any connection to the property. She now controls 3 farms and a small mill, more land than her husband ever dreamed of holding. She's hired labourers to work the fields, negotiated contracts with merchants, managed accounts, and made decisions that would have been unthinkable for a woman in her position before the catastrophe. Some people mutter about the impropriety of it, about women stepping out of their proper sphere, but Margaret simply shrugs. The work needs doing, she says. The property needs managing. If there's no man to do it, she'll do it herself. The quirky detail that catches your attention is the sudden importance of documentation. Before the plague, many property arrangements were informal, based on custom and memory, and the testimony of neighbours who could confirm long-standing relationships. But with so many witnesses dead, with memories unreliable and customs disputed, written documents have become crucial. People are suddenly interested in charters and deeds they ignored for generations. They're paying scribes to create records that can establish their claims. The survivors are learning, through painful experience, the value of having things in writing. You find yourself thinking about your own situation. You don't own property in any meaningful sense. You're a tenant on the manor, holding your land at the Lord's pleasure, owing labour and rents in exchange for the right to farm. But even your modest position has been affected by the inheritance chaos. The steward isn't sure what authority he has to enforce the customary obligations. The courts that would normally resolve disputes are backlogged for years. In the absence of clear lordship, a strange quasi-freedom has descended on the manor, a space where the old rules are still theoretically in force, but nobody is quite sure how to apply them. Some of your neighbours are taking advantage of this uncertainty. They're claiming strips of land that were previously held by families now extinct, arguing that someone needs to work the soil and they're willing to do it. They're reducing the labour services they owe to the manor, betting that the distracted steward won't notice or won't have the authority to punish them. They're accumulating property in ways that would have been impossible before the plague, building modest fortunes from the wreckage of the old order. Historians still argue about the overall effects of the inheritance disruption. Some emphasise the chaos and injustice, the legitimate heirs deprived of their birthright, the opportunists who profited from others' tragedy, the decades of legal conflict that consumed resources and attention. Others point to the mobility it created, the breaking up of rigid inheritance patterns, the opportunities for new families to acquire land, the redistribution of wealth from the dead to the living. What you observe at ground level is simply confusion. The steward does his best to maintain order, but he's operating without clear direction from above. The courts promise resolution, but resolution keeps getting delayed. The claimants to your manor hire lawyers and gather documents and wait, sometimes for years, for judgments that may never come. And in the meantime, life goes on. Fields are ploughed, rents are sometimes collected. The ordinary business of agriculture continues despite the uncertainty about who ultimately owns what. The winter is coming, and you have more immediate concerns than inheritance law. Your own harvest was adequate this year, enough to see you through the cold months if you're careful. You've set aside seed for spring planting, repaired your cottage as best you can, laid in firewood against the coming frosts. These practical necessities occupy your attention more than distant legal disputes. But sometimes, in quiet moments, you wonder what will happen when the inheritance questions are finally settled. Will the new lord, whoever that turns out to be, respect the informal arrangements that have emerged in his absence? Will the expanded freedoms, the reduced obligations, the accumulated properties be recognised or swept away? The uncertainty is exhausting, even if it's also, in its way, liberating. You go to bed that night with the sounds of autumn wind rattling your shutters, and you dream of documents and deeds, of courts and claims, of property changing hands in ways that make no sense. The old world, you realise even in your dreams, was easier to understand. Unjust, oppressive, limited, but comprehensible. This new world of fluid ownership and contested inheritance is more open, more possible, but also more confusing. You're not sure you'll ever feel entirely secure again, not sure the ground beneath your feet is as solid as it once seemed. You notice her at the well one morning, a woman you vaguely recognise from the other side of the village, drawing water with the practised efficiency of someone who's done it 1,000 times. But something about her has changed since you last paid attention. She carries herself differently now, straighter, more confident, with a directness in her gaze that wasn't there before. Her name is Agnes, and her story, you'll learn over the coming weeks, is becoming increasingly common in the post-plague world. Agnes was married at 15 to a man twice her age, a match arranged by her father for reasons that had more to do with land consolidation than affection. She bore 4 children in quick succession, 2 of whom survived infancy. She cooked and cleaned and spun wool and tended the garden, and did everything expected of a medieval wife, which is to say she worked constantly from dawn to dusk with little control over her own life. Her husband made the decisions, her husband owned the property, her husband represented the family in all dealings with the outside world. Then the plague came, and her husband died. So did one of her surviving children, and her father, and 2 of her brothers. When the dying stopped, Agnes found herself in a position she had never anticipated and had certainly never been prepared for. She was a widow with property, with no male relatives close enough to take control, with decisions to make and a household to run entirely on her own authority. The first months were terrifying, she tells you. She had never managed accounts, never negotiated with merchants, never dealt with the manor steward as anything other than a dependent appendage of her husband. She made mistakes, paid too much for seed grain, agreed to unfavourable terms with a buyer, trusted people she shouldn't have trusted, but she learned. Slowly, painfully, through trial and error, she learned how to do the things her husband had always done, and she discovered something that surprised her. She was good at it. Agnes's story is being repeated across Europe, in countless variations but with a common theme. The plague has created widows on an unprecedented scale, and those widows are stepping into roles that would never have been available to them otherwise. Some remarry quickly, eager to return to the familiar structure of a male-headed household. But others, more than you might expect, choose to remain single, at least for a time, enjoying the autonomy that widowhood provides. The legal status of widows has always been somewhat more favourable than that of married women. A widow could own property in her own name, enter into contracts, sue and be sued in court. A married woman, by contrast, was legally subsumed into her husband's identity, her property becoming his property, her legal existence effectively suspended for the duration of the marriage. The doctrine of coverture, as lawyers called it, meant that a wife was covered by her husband, represented by him in all legal matters. Widowhood lifted that cover, restoring a measure of legal personhood. Before the plague, most widows remarried relatively quickly, partly because social pressure pushed them in that direction, and partly because managing alone was genuinely difficult. But now, with labour scarce and opportunities abundant, remaining single has become more viable. A widow with property can hire workers to do the physical labour. She can engage in trade, manage a business, accumulate wealth. She can make decisions about her own life, where to live, how to work, whether and whom to marry, that married women cannot. You observe Agnes over the following months as she establishes herself as an independent operator. She's expanded her husband's modest landholding, taking over strips abandoned by families with no surviving heirs. She started a small brewing operation, producing ale that she sells to neighbours and at the local market. She's even taken on an apprentice, a young girl from a family too large to feed all its children, whom she's training in the domestic arts and, more unusually, in the basics of accounting and commerce. The guild system, traditionally hostile to female participation, has begun to crack open in some trades. You hear about widows who've taken over their husbands' workshops and been admitted to guild membership, at least provisionally. Weavers, brewers, chandlers, bakers, in trades where the work can be done by women and where the labour shortage makes exclusion impractical, the old barriers are becoming porous. It's not full equality by any means. Women still face restrictions and prejudices that men don't. But it's movement, change, a widening of possibilities. The marriage market has shifted as well, in ways that give women more leverage than they've ever had. Before the plague, women were abundant relative to men, and a woman's family often had to offer substantial dowries to attract suitable husbands. But now, with men dying in slightly higher numbers than women, and with the overall population drastically reduced, the balance has tipped. Men seeking wives find themselves competing for a smaller pool of candidates. Women, especially widows with property, can afford to be choosy. Agnes has had 3 proposals since her husband's death, she tells you with a wry smile. She's rejected all of them. The first suitor was too old. She'd already been married to one elderly man and wasn't interested in repeating the experience. The second was too controlling. She could tell from the way he talked that he expected to take over her affairs completely. The third was acceptable in many ways, but offered terms that would have reduced her status rather than enhancing it. She's waiting, she says, for the right situation, or perhaps for no situation at all. The freedom of widowhood has its own attractions. Historians still argue about the extent and durability of women's gains in the post-plague period. Some point to evidence of increased female participation in guilds and trades, of widows managing estates and businesses, of women exercising agency in marriage negotiations. Others note that the gains were often temporary, that as the population recovered and labour became less scarce, the old restrictions reasserted themselves. The patriarchal structure of medieval society was damaged by the plague but not destroyed. What you observe in your village suggests a mixed picture. Agnes and women like her have clearly expanded their sphere of action, taken on roles their mothers couldn't have imagined. But they still face hostility from some quarters, men who resent female competition, clergy who preach about women's proper subordination, traditionalists who see independent women as symptoms of social decay. Agnes has learned to navigate this hostility, to pick her battles, to exercise her new freedoms without unnecessarily provoking opposition. There's a quirky detail about post-plague marriage patterns that might interest you. In some regions, the church has relaxed its restrictions on remarriage, allowing widows and widowers to marry again more quickly than canon law technically permitted. The reasoning's practical. With so many people dead, the survivors need to form new households, produce new children, rebuild the population. Theological niceties about mourning periods and proper intervals seem less important than the urgent need for reproduction. Some widows remarry within weeks of their husbands' deaths, arrangements that would have been scandalous before the plague. You think about your own situation, your own relationship to the changing dynamics between men and women. You're neither married nor widowed, just a survivor trying to make sense of the new world. But you can see that the women around you are experiencing that world differently than the men, facing different obstacles and enjoying different opportunities. The plague has reshuffled the deck, and some of the new hands being dealt are more interesting than the old ones. Agnes waves goodbye as she heads back to her cottage, water bucket balanced on her hip. That new confidence evident in every step. She's not waiting for permission anymore, not deferring to male authority that no longer exists in her life. She's making her own decisions, running her own affairs, building something that belongs to her. It's not what her mother's life looked like, or her grandmother's. It's something new, emerging from the wreckage of the old order, uncertain and fragile but real. The sun is climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist, promising a decent day for the work ahead. You have your own tasks to attend to, your own small corner of the post-plague world to manage, but you carry with you the image of Agnes at the well, drawing water and drawing conclusions about what's possible for someone like her. The rules are changing, the boundaries are shifting, and some of the people most affected by those changes are the ones who are most constrained by the old rules. The women who are discovering, in the midst of catastrophe, unexpected room to grow. The first sign of trouble comes in the form of a tax collector, a pinch-faced man with a leather satchel who arrives in your village on a spring morning in 1381 and begins going door to door demanding payment. This is the third poll tax in 4 years, he explains with evident boredom, and every person over the age of 15 owes 1 shilling to the crown. No exceptions, no excuses. Pay up or face the consequences. 1 shilling per person is a staggering sum for most of the villagers. It's more than a week's wages for an agricultural labourer, even at the inflated post-plague rates. A family of 5 might owe 5 shillings, a month's income or more, for the privilege of being counted and taxed by a government that has done nothing visible to help them through the catastrophe of the last 30 years. The resentment that has been simmering since the Statute of Labourers, since the failed attempts to freeze wages and restrict movement, finally begins to boil over. You stand in the lane with your neighbours, watching the tax collector work his way through the village, and you can feel the anger radiating from the people around you. This isn't the quiet, resigned anger of peasants who know their place and accept their lot. This is something sharper, more dangerous, fed by decades of broken promises and accumulated grievances. The plague taught these people that death doesn't respect social hierarchies. The years since have taught them that neither does the government. It takes from the poor to fund wars and luxuries for the rich, enforces laws designed to keep workers in poverty, treats the labouring classes as resources to be exploited rather than subjects to be served. The poll tax is the spark, but the tinder has been building for a generation. Remember the Statute of Labourers, that attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels? Remember the prosecutions and fines, the constant harassment of workers trying to better their conditions. Remember the sumptuary laws that tried to dictate what clothes people could wear, the inheritance chaos that left property rights uncertain, the general sense that the old order was crumbling but the powerful were determined to maintain their privileges regardless. All of this feeds into what happens next. The largest popular uprising England has ever seen. A genuine mass rebellion that will shake the kingdom to its foundations and demonstrate once and for all that the post-plague world cannot simply return to the pre-plague status quo. The tax collector leaves your village with less money than he expected. Several families have hidden, others have simply refused to pay, and he lacks the force to compel them. But the word spreads quickly that similar scenes are playing out across the southeastern counties. In Essex and Kent, resistance is organising. Men are gathering, sharing grievances, making plans. A preacher named John Ball, who has been railing against social inequality for years, is drawing crowds with his provocative question: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? That question, simple as it sounds, strikes at the heart of the feudal order. The nobility justify their privileges by appealing to ancient lineages, to blood rights that supposedly stretch back to the Norman conquest and beyond. But if you go back far enough, back to Eden, back to the beginning, there were no nobles and no peasants, just men and women working together as equals. The social hierarchy that seems so natural and inevitable is, Ball suggests, a human construction, and what humans have constructed, humans can tear down. You hear these ideas discussed in the alehouse, debated at the well, whispered in the fields where workers bend over their labour. Not everyone agrees with the radicals, of course. Some people are frightened, worried about the consequences of challenging the established order. Some are sceptical, doubting that anything will really change regardless of what the rebels do. But there's a current of excitement, of possibility, that you haven't felt before. Something is happening. Something big. By early June, the rebellion is in full swing. Peasant armies are marching on London, their numbers growing as they go. They're led by a man named Wat Tyler, about whom historians still argue. Was he a genuine revolutionary, a pragmatic negotiator, or just a skilled opportunist who happened to be in the right place at the right time? What's clear is that he can command men, inspire loyalty, channel the diffuse anger of thousands into coordinated action. The rebels' demands, when they articulate them, are both radical and surprisingly specific. They want the abolition of serfdom, the end of the legal bondage that ties peasants to the land and subjects them to their lord's arbitrary authority. They want fixed rents instead of unlimited labour obligations. They want the right to buy and sell freely, to move where they please, to negotiate their own terms of employment. They want, in short, to be treated as free people rather than as property. They also want justice for specific grievances, the poll tax, obviously, but also the corrupt officials who enforce it, the lawyers who manipulate the legal system, the clergy who preach submission while living in luxury. Their anger is both systemic and personal, aimed at abstract structures of oppression and at the specific human beings who embody those structures. You follow the news as best you can, piecing together what's happening from travellers' reports and marketplace gossip. The rebels have entered London. They've burned the Savoy Palace, the magnificent residence of John of Gaunt, the most powerful nobleman in England. They've opened the prisons, freed the inmates, executed several of the king's most hated ministers. For a few extraordinary days, the common people of England hold power in the capital, and no one knows what will happen next. The young King Richard II, just 14 years old, meets with the rebels at Mile End outside London. He agrees to their demands, or seems to. He issues charters promising the abolition of serfdom, the end of labour laws, freedom for all. The rebels, many of them, take him at his word and begin dispersing, heading home with their precious charters in hand. But it's a trap, or at least a delay. The next day, at another meeting at Smithfield, Wat Tyler is killed, stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London in circumstances that remain murky and disputed. The rebels waver, leaderless, and Richard rides forward alone to address them. "I am your captain," he declares, with remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. "Follow me." They do, bewildered, and the moment of danger passes. Within weeks, the rebellion is crushed, its leaders executed, its charters revoked. "Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain," the king supposedly tells a delegation of peasants who come to remind him of his promises. The quirky detail that strikes you, hearing about these events, is how close the rebels came to success. For a few days they genuinely held power in London. The king was at their mercy. The nobility was scattered and frightened. If they had pushed harder, if they had been more ruthless, if Wat Tyler hadn't been killed at that crucial moment, who knows what might have happened? Historians still argue about whether the rebellion ever had a realistic chance of achieving its goals, whether the structural forces arrayed against it were simply too powerful to overcome. The immediate aftermath is brutal. Hundreds of rebels are executed. The poll tax is abandoned. That much at least the rebellion accomplishes, but the broader demands for freedom are rejected. Serfdom continues. The labour laws remain on the books. The social hierarchy reasserts itself, apparently unchanged. And yet, something has shifted that cannot be entirely unshifted. The rebels have demonstrated that the common people, when pushed too far, will push back. The authorities have been reminded that their power ultimately depends on the acquiescence of those they rule, and that acquiescence cannot be taken for granted. The ideas John Ball preached about natural equality, about the illegitimacy of inherited privilege, don't disappear just because their spokesman is hanged. They go underground, circulate in whispers, wait for their next moment. You return to your daily life, ploughing and planting and harvesting as the seasons turn, but you carry with you the memory of those weeks when everything seemed possible. The rebellion failed, yes, but it also happened, which means that rebellions can happen, that the powerful are not as invulnerable as they seem, that the future is not simply a continuation of the past. That knowledge is dangerous, and you're careful about who you share it with. But it stays with you, a small flame that even defeat cannot entirely extinguish. The years after the rebellion bring a strange, gradual transformation that's almost harder to notice than a dramatic upheaval. The crushing of the peasants' revolt seems, at first, to have changed nothing. The lords are still lords, the peasants are still peasants. The laws that bind workers to the land remain on the books, enforced by courts that show no sympathy for those who resist. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the old system of serfdom is dying. You notice it first in the small things. The manor steward, who once demanded strict accounting of every labour service owed, has become more flexible about accepting cash payments instead. The boundary between free tenants and villains, once rigidly maintained, has grown blurry as record-keeping lapses and memories fade. Young people who would once have been bound to the land are slipping away to towns and other manors, and nobody seems to have the energy or resources to pursue them. The economic logic is simple and irresistible. Labour is still scarce, even decades after the plague. Landowners who insist on extracting unpaid labour from resentful serfs find themselves with a demoralised workforce that does the minimum possible. Landowners who offer competitive terms, cash wages, secure tenancies, reduced obligations, attract willing workers who have reason to care about their labour's results. The market, in its impersonal way, is doing what the rebellion couldn't. It's making serfdom uneconomical. You watch this process unfold on your own manor, where the new lord, finally installed after years of inheritance disputes, has adopted a pragmatic approach. He's converted most of the customary labour services to money rents, preferring reliable cash income to unreliable compelled labour. He's granted long-term leases to tenants who can demonstrate their productivity, giving them security that their parents never had. He's even begun selling off portions of the domain, the land he traditionally farmed directly using serf labour, to tenants who are eager to become independent proprietors. This isn't happening because the Lord has suddenly discovered social justice. It's happening because he's done the math. A serf who owes 3 days of labour per week will work those days with obvious reluctance, doing as little as possible, watching the sun for the moment when obligation ends. A free labourer who's paid by the task, or a tenant farmer who keeps most of what he produces, has every incentive to work harder and smarter. The same amount of land, worked by motivated workers, produces more than it does when worked by sullen serfs. The transformation varies dramatically by region, and this is where the story gets complicated. In England and much of Western Europe, the trend is clearly toward the dissolution of serfdom, the conversion of labour obligations to cash payments, the gradual emergence of a class of independent tenant farmers and wage labourers. But in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Prussia, in Russia, something very different is happening, something that historians call the second serfdom. You hear about it from merchants who travel the Baltic trade routes, who bring back tales of a world moving in the opposite direction from yours. In the East, lords are tightening their control over the peasantry, not loosening it. Labour obligations are increasing, not decreasing. The legal restrictions on peasant movement are becoming more severe, not less. The plague created the same labour shortage there as it did here, but the lords responded differently, by doubling down on coercion rather than adapting to the market. Why the divergence? Historians still argue about this, but several factors seem relevant. In Western Europe, strong monarchies and developed legal systems limited the power of individual lords, making it harder for them to simply impose their will on unwilling peasants. Towns provided alternative destinations for people fleeing rural exploitation, and urban economies were robust enough to absorb them. The labour shortage gave workers leverage, and the fragmented political landscape made it difficult for lords to coordinate a unified response. In Eastern Europe, the situation was different. Towns were fewer and weaker, offering less refuge for fleeing serfs. Monarchies were less developed, leaving more power in the hands of local nobles. And crucially, the Eastern European economy was increasingly oriented toward exporting grain to Western markets, creating incentives for lords to maximise production through forced labour rather than through market mechanisms. When you're selling grain by the shipload to Amsterdam merchants, the cheapest way to produce it is to compel peasants to grow it for free. The quirky detail that sticks with you is how the same catastrophe, the Black Death, could produce such opposite outcomes in different places. In the West, it weakened the bonds of servitude. In the East, it strengthened them. The difference wasn't in the disease itself, but in the political, economic and social context that shaped how people responded. The plague was the earthquake. The different landscapes determined what collapsed and what remained standing. Back in your village, the slow death of serfdom continues its quiet progress. You're technically still a villain, still bound by law to your lord's manor, still subject to restrictions on your movement and your choices. But in practice, those restrictions matter less and less with each passing year. The steward doesn't bother tracking who comes and goes. The courts that would enforce manorial obligations are distant and expensive to invoke. The lord himself seems more interested in cash income than in maintaining legal fictions that serve no practical purpose. You've taken advantage of this loosening to improve your situation in ways that would have been unthinkable for your grandparents. You've accumulated strips of land, some rented, some effectively claimed from families that died without heirs. You've diversified your labour, working not just as a farmer, but as a part-time craftsman, selling goods at the market that you make during the winter months. You've set aside money, actual money, coins in a hidden pot, against future needs and opportunities. Your children, if you have them, will grow up in a world where serfdom is a fading memory, rather than a living reality. They'll be able to choose where to live, whom to work for, what trades to pursue. They'll make decisions that you couldn't have made, live lives that you couldn't have lived. The revolution that the rebels of 1381 demanded is happening after all, just slowly, through economic forces rather than political confrontation, through countless individual negotiations rather than a single dramatic rupture. The manor house still stands, still occupied by a lord who claims authority over this land and its people. But the relationship between that house and the cottages scattered around it has fundamentally changed. It's no longer a relationship of compulsion, of bodies bound to soil, of labour extracted through legal coercion. It's increasingly a relationship of contract, of negotiation, of mutual if unequal exchange. The lord needs tenants and workers. The tenants and workers need land and employment. Each side has something the other wants, and the terms are worked out through a process that, however imperfect, at least recognises both parties as having interests worth considering. You walk through your village on a summer evening, noting the changes that have accumulated over the years. That cottage was abandoned after the plague and has been taken over by a family from elsewhere, who pay rent directly in cash rather than in labour. That field was once part of the domain and is now held by a tenant on a long lease, practically an owner in all but name. That workshop belongs to a craftsman who came here because the terms were favourable, who owes no feudal obligations at all, who is as free as any peasant in Europe. The old order is dying, not with a bang but with a whimper, not through revolution but through evolution. The plague set it in motion. The economic forces it unleashed are carrying it forward, and you, standing in the middle of it, are watching a world transform around you, slowly enough that you can almost miss it, but surely enough that there's no going back. The sun sets behind the manor house, casting long shadows across the fields that were once worked by serfs, and are now worked by tenants, labourers and small proprietors. The boundary between bondage and freedom, which once seemed as solid as the stone walls of the church, has grown porous, permeable, almost invisible. You're not sure exactly what you are anymore, serf or free, bound or unbound, and increasingly, it doesn't seem to matter. What matters is the work you do, the money you earn, the life you're building. The labels can take care of themselves. The merchant who passes through your village every few months brings news from the east, and lately his stories have taken on a darker tone. He trades along routes that stretch from the Baltic coast down through the German lands, and what he describes sounds like a mirror image of your own experience, familiar in its broad outlines but reversed in its direction. In Poland, he tells you, the nobles have convinced the king to issue decrees restricting peasant movement. A serf can no longer leave his lord's land without permission, and obtaining that permission has become nearly impossible. The labour obligations that were once negotiable have been fixed by law at levels that consume most of a peasant's working week. The freedom that your grandparents might have dreamed of, that your own generation has begun to taste, is being systematically eliminated for their counterparts across the continent. You listen to these stories with a mixture of horror and confused gratitude. Horror because you can imagine what it would feel like to have the noose tightening just when you thought you might escape. Gratitude because, for whatever reason, your own corner of the world has moved in the opposite direction. The same catastrophe that set you free is being used elsewhere to bind others more tightly than ever. The phenomenon the merchant describes, what historians will later call the Second Serfdom, represents one of the stranger divergences in European history. In the century after the Black Death, Western Europe and Eastern Europe take dramatically different paths. The West moves toward freer labour, market relationships, the gradual dissolution of feudal bonds. The East moves toward harsher servitude, expanded noble power, the reduction of peasants to something approaching slavery. The reasons for this divergence are complex and still debated. One factor is political. Western European monarchies were generally stronger, more capable of restraining noble power, more interested in maintaining a balance between different social classes. Eastern European monarchies were weaker, more dependent on noble support, more willing to grant concessions that enhanced aristocratic control over the peasantry. When the labour shortage gave peasants potential leverage, Western kings sometimes sided with the workers against the lords. Eastern kings consistently sided with the lords against the workers. Another factor is urban development. Western Europe had a dense network of towns and cities, commercial centres where escaped serfs could find work and eventually gain legal freedom. The medieval rule that a year and a day of residence in a town made a serf legally free gave rural workers an escape route, a destination that offered hope. Eastern Europe had fewer towns, and they were weaker, less able to resist noble pressure, less capable of absorbing large numbers of rural migrants. There was nowhere for Eastern peasants to run. A third factor is the structure of the economy. Eastern European agriculture was increasingly oriented toward export. Grain, timber and other bulk commodities shipped to Western markets through ports like Danzig and Riga. This export orientation created incentives for lords to maximise production at minimal cost, and the cheapest way to do that was through forced labour. Western European agriculture was more diversified, more market-oriented internally, with landowners finding it profitable to work with rather than against the labour market. The merchant shakes his head as he describes conditions in some of the territories he's visited. Peasants who are bought and sold along with the land they work. Families separated at the lord's whim. Punishments for attempting to flee that include branding, mutilation, even death. The lords have effectively captured the state, using government power to enforce their private interests, and there's no counterbalancing force strong enough to resist them. You think about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, about the rebels who marched on London demanding freedom, about the brutal suppression that followed. At the time, it seemed like a catastrophic defeat, proof that the powerful would always prevail. But now, decades later, you're living in a world where those rebels' demands are slowly being realised, not through political revolution, but through economic change. The lords tried to hold back the tide and failed. The market proved stronger than the law. In the East, the opposite has happened. The lords succeeded where your lords failed. They captured the state, bent the law to their purposes, used political power to override economic forces. The peasants there tried to resist, no doubt. You hear fragments of stories about uprisings and protests, but they were crushed, and their crushing was made permanent through legal structures that will persist for centuries. The quirky detail that haunts you is the arbitrariness of it all. You and your Eastern counterparts started in the same place, faced the same catastrophe, lived through the same upheaval, but different political circumstances, different economic structures, different decisions by different rulers have sent you down utterly divergent paths. You're becoming freer while they're becoming more enslaved, and neither of you did anything to deserve your respective fates. This divergence will have consequences that echo through history. Western Europe's freer labour markets will eventually contribute to economic dynamism, technological innovation, the accumulation of capital that funds further development. Eastern Europe's servile agriculture will produce stagnation, underdevelopment, a widening gap with the West that will take centuries to close. The paths that diverge in the 15th century will shape the world of the 20th and beyond. But you don't know any of this, standing in your village listening to a merchant's tales from distant lands. You only know that things could have been different, that the relative freedom you enjoy was not inevitable, that somewhere across the map there are people very much like you, living lives of bondage that you've escaped. It makes your own situation feel more precious, more fragile, more worth protecting. You offer the merchant another cup of ale, grateful for his news even when it's grim. He accepts with a weary smile, clearly tired from weeks on the road, and shifts the conversation to lighter topics. The quality of wool in different regions, the fashions in the great cities, the gossip he's picked up along the way. The heaviness of the earlier discussion fades into the ordinary rhythms of commerce and conversation. Later that evening, alone in your cottage, you find yourself thinking about paths and choices, about the strange contingency of history. Your grandparents were serfs, bound to the land, with no expectation that their descendants would live differently. Your grandchildren, if the current trends continue, will be free tenants, or even small proprietors, making their own decisions about their lives and labour. The transformation is happening within living memory, within the span of a few generations, and yet it didn't have to happen this way. Different kings, different laws, different balances of power, and you might be the one whose descendants face generations of deepening bondage. The Black Death didn't determine the outcome, it only created the conditions for change. What humans did with those conditions, what choices they made, what struggles they fought, what institutions they built or destroyed, that's what shaped the future. The fire burns low in your hearth, and you bank it carefully for the night. Tomorrow there will be work to do, fields to tend, the ordinary business of survival in an uncertain world. But tonight you carry with you an awareness of how different things might have been, how different they are for people not so far away. It's a sobering thought, and also a motivating one. The freedom you have, partial and imperfect as it is, was not given freely. It was won through struggles both dramatic and mundane, through market forces and political contests, through the slow accumulation of small gains. It could still be lost if circumstances changed, if the powerful found ways to reassert control. Nothing is permanent, nothing is guaranteed. You lie down on your pallet, pulling the rough blanket over you, listening to the night sounds outside your window. An owl hoots somewhere in the darkness. A dog barks in the distance. The world goes on, indifferent to the grand patterns that scholars will one day trace across its surface. You close your eyes, and your last thought before sleep is of the eastern peasants the merchant described, your counterparts in bondage, whose fate reminds you to value what you have and to never take it for granted. The young man arrives at your village with ink-stained fingers and an eager expression, and when he speaks, you notice immediately that his accent marks him as educated, as someone who's spent time in places where Latin is spoken daily and books are more common than ploughs. He's a student from one of the universities travelling home for a break between terms, and he's happy to share news of the intellectual world with anyone who'll listen. The universities, he tells you, are changing. The plague devastated them, of course. Oxford lost perhaps a third of its scholars, Cambridge nearly as many, and the continental universities suffered similarly. Entire faculties were wiped out. Libraries lost their keepers. The accumulated knowledge of generations was endangered when the people who carried that knowledge in their heads died faster than they could pass it on. But something unexpected has emerged from the wreckage. The universities are rebuilding, and as they rebuild, they're rethinking what they teach and how they teach it. New institutions are being founded to replace what was lost and to meet new demands. The old curriculum, focused narrowly on theology, law and medicine, is expanding to include subjects that would have seemed frivolous or dangerous a century ago. You listen with the peculiar fascination of someone for whom universities are almost mythical places, as remote and fantastical as the courts of kings. You'll never attend one, obviously. They're for the sons of nobles and wealthy merchants, for clergy destined for high church offices, for the elite of society. But the student's enthusiasm is infectious, and you find yourself drawn into his descriptions of debates and lectures, of libraries and laboratories, of ideas that challenge everything previous generations believed. The plague, he explains, has undermined confidence in the old authorities. The ancient texts that medieval scholars revered, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, proved inadequate guides when the pestilence struck. Physicians who followed Galen's prescriptions watched their patients die regardless. Philosophers who trusted Aristotle's categories couldn't make sense of a catastrophe that defied all categories. The Black Death was a massive empirical failure of traditional learning, and some scholars are drawing the obvious conclusion. Perhaps the ancients didn't have all the answers. This skepticism toward received wisdom is feeding into broader intellectual changes. The movement that will eventually be called humanism, a renewed interest in classical texts, certainly, but also a new emphasis on human experience, human capability, human potential, is gaining ground in the universities. Scholars are reading ancient authors not as unquestionable authorities, but as fellow inquirers, people who might be right about some things and wrong about others, whose ideas should be tested against observation and reason rather than simply accepted. The student mentions names you don't recognize: Petrarch, Boccaccio, scholars in Italian cities who are pioneering new approaches to learning. He talks about the recovery of lost texts, manuscripts discovered in monastery libraries and brought back into circulation, ideas that had been forgotten for centuries now available to anyone who can read Latin. He describes debates between conservatives who want to preserve traditional curricula and reformers who want to open the universities to new subjects and new methods. Vernacular languages, he adds, are gaining academic respectability. For centuries, Latin was the only language of serious learning. Anything written in English or French or German was considered unworthy of scholarly attention. But the plague killed Latin speakers disproportionately: the educated, the clergy, the people who maintained the language's dominance. And the survivors have had to adapt. More texts are being written in vernacular languages. More teaching is happening in languages ordinary people can understand. The exclusive club of Latin literacy is, slowly, opening its doors. You hear a quirky detail that makes you smile despite the grim context. Some universities have had to lower their admission standards because there simply aren't enough qualified candidates to fill the vacancies left by plague deaths. Young men who would never have been accepted before, those with imperfect Latin, those from undistinguished families, those without the usual connections, are finding places at institutions that would previously have rejected them. The intellectual elite, like every other elite, has been thinned by mortality, and the spaces left behind are being filled by newcomers. New universities are being founded too, partly to meet demand and partly because existing institutions are associated with the catastrophe. The student mentions Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg, Krakow, universities established in the decades after the Black Death, often with royal patronage, often with curricula that reflect newer thinking rather than slavish adherence to tradition. The educational map of Europe is being redrawn, with new centres of learning emerging to complement or challenge the old ones. The changes extend to what's taught as well as where it's taught. Medicine, chastened by its failure against the plague, is becoming more empirical, more willing to question ancient authorities, more interested in observation and experiment. Law is adapting to new economic realities, developing doctrines that address the unprecedented problems of post-plague property and labour relations. Even theology is evolving, as scholars grapple with questions that the catastrophe has made urgent. Why did God permit such suffering? How should the Church respond to challenges to its authority? What does it mean to live faithfully in a world that seems chaotic and unpredictable? You ask the student what he's studying, and he tells you with obvious pride, grammar and rhetoric, the foundational arts that prepare students for more advanced work. But he's also reading widely on his own, following his curiosity into areas that aren't officially part of the curriculum. He's interested in natural philosophy, what we would call science, and in history, and in the new literary works being produced in Italian that everyone's talking about. The traditional paths are still there, but increasingly students are finding ways around them. Walking home that evening after the student has continued on his journey, you find yourself thinking about knowledge and how it changes. Your own education was minimal, some basic reading taught by the parish priest, enough arithmetic to conduct simple transactions, a grab bag of practical skills passed down from parents and neighbours. The world of universities and scholars has always seemed impossibly distant, relevant to your life only insofar as it trained the priests and physicians and lawyers who occasionally touched your existence. But the student's enthusiasm has planted a seed of something in your mind. The idea that knowledge isn't fixed, that even the greatest authorities can be wrong, that learning is a process of discovery rather than just a reception of handed-down truths. This feels important somehow, relevant even to a peasant in a village far from any centre of learning. If the scholars are questioning their inherited assumptions, perhaps everyone should be. If the old answers proved inadequate against the plague, perhaps new answers are possible, and perhaps finding them doesn't require Latin or university degrees or ecclesiastical approval. You'll never be a scholar, never read the texts the student mentioned, never participate in the debates that are reshaping European thought. But you live in a world that those debates will gradually transform. The ideas percolating in universities will eventually filter down through sermons and popular books and conversations with travellers like today's student, until they shape how everyone thinks about themselves and their world. The knowledge revolution that the Black Death has accelerated won't produce its full effects for centuries, but it starts here, in the decades after the plague, in the questioning of authority that catastrophe inspired, in the new institutions and new curricula and new methods that are emerging from the wreckage. You're living at the beginning of something, even if you can't see its full shape yet. The stars are coming out as you reach your cottage, pinpricks of light in a darkening sky. Those stars, you've been told, are fixed in crystalline spheres that rotate around the earth, following paths decreed by God at the creation. That's what the authorities teach, what the ancients believed, what everyone has always accepted. But if the student is right, even that certainty is being questioned somewhere, tested against observations that don't quite fit the traditional model. The universe itself is becoming uncertain, open to inquiry, subject to revision. You go inside, light your fire, prepare your simple evening meal. The conversation with the student has left you slightly dazed, your head full of ideas you don't quite understand. But underneath the confusion there's something else, a sense of possibility, of a world opening up, of assumptions cracking to reveal unexpected spaces beneath. The plague destroyed so much, people, communities, certainties. But in the destruction something new is growing. The windmill appears on the ridge above the next village in the spring of your 40th year, and you stand staring at it for a long moment, marvelling at how quickly things change when necessity demands it. Before the plague, there was talk of building such a structure, but the lord who owned this land preferred to maintain his watermill monopoly, and besides, labour was cheap enough that technological improvements seemed unnecessary. Now the watermill sits abandoned. The miller died, his apprentice died, and nobody remained who knew how to maintain the complicated mechanism, and this elegant solution has risen in its place. The windmill represents something larger than itself, a shift in how people think about work and the tools that make it possible. When labour was abundant and cheap, there was little incentive to invest in labour-saving devices. Why build an expensive machine when you could simply hire more workers? But the plague has inverted that calculation. Workers are scarce and expensive. Machines, once built, work tirelessly without demanding wages or threatening to leave for better opportunities. The economics of innovation have fundamentally changed. You see evidence of this shift everywhere you look. The village blacksmith has acquired new tools that allow him to work faster and with less effort. The farmers are experimenting with different ploughing techniques, trying to get more yield from less labour. Even in your own cottage, you've adopted small improvements. A better spindle, a more efficient loom, that would have seemed extravagant luxuries when hands were plentiful. The windmill's sails turn lazily in the spring breeze, grinding grain for customers who come from miles around. Its operator, a clever man who saw the opportunity and invested his accumulated savings in the project, is becoming prosperous. He charges for his services, of course, but his prices are fair, and the convenience of not having to travel to the distant watermill makes the cost worthwhile. The old monopolies are breaking down along with the old labour relations. Technology, your learning, doesn't just appear from nowhere. It requires incentives, resources, and circumstances that favour adoption. The knowledge of how to build windmills existed before the plague. The Low Countries had them for generations. But it took the labour crisis to make that knowledge relevant here, to create conditions where the investment made sense. The same principles apply across dozens of other innovations that are spreading through post-plague Europe. Agricultural improvements are perhaps the most significant. You hear about the Norfolk four-course rotation, a system that eliminates the need to leave fields fallow by alternating grain crops with legumes and turnips. The legumes fix nitrogen in the soil while providing food for livestock. The livestock produce manure that fertilises the grain fields. The whole system produces more food with less labour than traditional methods. Before the plague, such innovations struggled to gain traction. Why change what's always worked when labour is cheap? Now, farmers are eager for any technique that might help them produce more with fewer hands. Horse harnesses have improved, allowing draft animals to pull heavier loads more efficiently. Metal tools have become more common, replacing wooden implements that required more effort and wore out faster. Water-powered hammers are appearing in smithies, doing work that once required teams of men. The printing press hasn't been invented yet. That's still decades away. But when it arrives, it will emerge into a world already primed to adopt labour-saving technologies. The quirky detail that catches your attention is how the plague has affected clockmaking. Mechanical clocks, which existed before the catastrophe but were rare and unreliable, are suddenly in higher demand. With fewer workers available, time itself has become more valuable, more worth measuring and managing. Town squares are acquiring clock towers, monasteries that once marked time by the sun and the canonical hours are installing mechanical timekeepers. The precision that clocks represent, the division of the day into equal measurable units, will eventually reshape how everyone thinks about work and productivity. You visit the windmill one afternoon, curious to see how it works up close. The operator, pleased to have an interested audience, explains the mechanism with obvious pride. The sails catch the wind and turn a shaft. The shaft connects through wooden gears to the grinding stones. The whole system is calibrated so that the stones turn at just the right speed. Too fast and the grain burns, too slow and the grinding takes forever. It's ingenious, really. The application of basic mechanical principles that transforms an unpredictable natural force into steady, useful work. Walking home, you think about all the labour that windmill replaces. Before, grinding grain meant either doing it by hand, exhausting, time-consuming work, or travelling to a watermill that might be far away and that operated only when the water level was right. Now, as long as the wind blows, the mill works. One operator, with occasional help, can serve an entire region. The freed labour can go elsewhere, to tasks that can't be mechanized, to productive activities that wouldn't have been possible when everyone was tied up grinding grain. This pattern, technology replacing labour, freeing people for other work, will eventually transform not just agriculture, but every sector of the economy. It will take centuries to play out fully, with setbacks and reversals along the way. But the post-plague decades are crucial, establishing habits of innovation and investment that will compound over time. The labour shortage that seemed like a crisis has become, paradoxically, an engine of progress. Not everyone benefits equally from these changes, of course. The workers whose labour is replaced by machines sometimes find themselves worse off, at least temporarily. The millers who once held monopolies on grain grinding resent the competition from windmills. The lords who invested in watermills see their assets depreciated. Technological change creates losers as well as winners, and the losers don't always go quietly. But the overall trajectory is clear, at least in hindsight. Europe is becoming a more technologically sophisticated place, a society that invests in tools and machines and techniques that amplify human capability. The roots of this transformation extend back before the plague, of course. Medieval Europe was never as technologically stagnant as stereotype suggests. But the Black Death accelerated the process, creating incentives and removing obstacles that had previously slowed adoption. You return to your cottage as the sun begins to set, thinking about the windmill's sails turning against the evening sky. Your grandparents lived in a world where most work was done by human muscle, where tools were simple and machines were rare, where the pace of change was so slow that each generation lived much as the previous one had. Your grandchildren will live in a different world, one where machines do more of the heavy work, where innovation is expected rather than exceptional, where the relationship between labour and production has been fundamentally restructured. The fire crackles in your hearth as you prepare your evening meal. Outside, the spring wind that powers the new windmill rustles through the budding trees. You're tired from the day's work. There's always work, no matter how many machines are built. But it's a different kind of tiredness than your grandparents knew. The load is lighter, the tools are better, the possibilities are wider. The plague destroyed so much, but in the space it created, something new is being built. You eat your meal in the quiet of your cottage, listening to the night sounds outside, thinking about change and continuity, about the world you were born into and the world you'll leave behind. The windmill on the ridge is just one small sign of the transformation underway, one visible symbol of invisible forces reshaping everything. You don't fully understand those forces, couldn't articulate them in the language of economics or technology, but you feel them, in the rhythm of your days and the quality of your tools and the options available to you. Tomorrow you'll wake to another day of work, another small contribution to the ongoing project of survival, and maybe even progress. The windmill will turn, grinding grain for bread that will feed families across the region. The blacksmith will hammer metal into tools that make other work easier. The whole intricate system will keep moving, driven by forces both human and natural, building toward a future that nobody can quite see, but that everyone is helping to create. The smell hits you before you see the source. Meat roasting, rich and fatty, the kind of aroma that would have stopped you in your tracks with desperate longing when you were a child. But now it's just Tuesday, and your neighbour is cooking a joint of mutton for her family's dinner. And this abundance that would have seemed miraculous a generation ago has become almost ordinary. You're eating better than your parents ever did. This simple fact, so easy to overlook in the daily rhythm of meals and work, represents one of the most significant changes the plague has wrought. The catastrophic death toll, which seemed like pure horror when it was happening, has left the survivors with more of everything. More land per person, more livestock per household, more food on every table. The mathematics of it are straightforward, even if nobody sits down to calculate them explicitly. Before the plague, Europe's population had grown to perhaps 75 million people, pressing against the limits of what medieval agriculture could support. Land was scarce. Competition for resources was fierce. The typical peasant diet consisted mainly of bread and pottage. Grain-based food stretched as far as possible to feed hungry mouths. Meat was a luxury, reserved for feast days and special occasions, a rare treat that most people tasted only a few times a year. Now, with the population roughly halved and the land unchanged, the calculus has shifted dramatically. The same fields that barely fed your grandparents can now abundantly feed your smaller generation. Surplus grain that once went to human mouths now feeds livestock, which means more animals, which means more meat, dairy and eggs. The diet of ordinary people has improved in ways that would have seemed like fantasy to those who died in the plague years. You notice it in the village children, who are taller and sturdier than the children you remember from your own youth. They're not malnourished, not stunted by chronic hunger, not weakened by the borderline starvation that was once the common lot of the peasant young. They have energy to play, strength to work, resistance to the minor illnesses that once carried away the weakest. The demographic catastrophe, paradoxically, has made the survivors healthier. The evidence extends beyond your immediate observation. Historians studying this period will eventually document the post-plague dietary improvements through various sources: manor records showing increased meat consumption, skeletal remains indicating better nutrition, contemporary accounts marvelling at how well the common people eat. The correlation between population decline and improved living standards is clear, even if the relationship feels morally uncomfortable. Bread, still the staple food, has improved in quality as well as quantity. Before the plague, the poor ate bread made from mixed grains: rye, barley, oats, often adulterated with cheaper materials to stretch limited supplies. White wheat bread was for the wealthy, but now, with grain abundant and labour valuable, ordinary people increasingly eat the finer bread that was once reserved for their betters. The social distinctions that played out in food, the visible hierarchy of bread colours and meat access, are blurring along with so many other boundaries. You sit down to your own midday meal, a chunk of good wheat bread, a wedge of cheese, some pickled vegetables from your garden, and a small piece of salt pork left over from last winter's slaughter. It's not a feast by noble standards, but it's substantial, nourishing, the kind of meal that would have marked a prosperous farmer before the plague. Now it's just lunch, unremarkable, taken for granted. The quirky detail that occurs to you chewing your bread in the quiet of your cottage is how quickly abundance becomes normal. Your grandparents would have wept with joy at this meal. Your parents would have considered it a special occasion. You barely notice it, already accustomed to eating well, your expectations adjusted to the new reality. The human capacity to adapt works in both directions. We can survive terrible deprivation, but we can also lose appreciation for genuine blessings. Ale consumption has increased too, you've noticed. With surplus grain available and money in workers' pockets, brewing has become more common and more varied. The thin, barely alcoholic small beer that was once the standard beverage has been supplemented by stronger brews. Taverns are doing good business. People have the leisure to drink and socialise in ways that subsistence living never permitted. Some moralists complain about this, of course. The clergy thunder against gluttony and drunkenness, seeing in the improved diet evidence of moral decay. If people are eating better, they say, it's because they've abandoned the virtuous simplicity of their ancestors, given in to earthly appetites, forgotten that this world is merely a preparation for the next. The post-plague prosperity becomes, in some sermons, just another sign of the corruption that brought God's judgment in the first place. But the complaints ring hollow to people who remember genuine hunger. You remember it yourself. Winters when the food ran low, and the spring seemed impossibly far away, meals stretched with water and hope, the gnawing anxiety of not knowing whether there would be enough. That memory doesn't fade, even as the reality improves. You eat your bread and cheese with a gratitude that comes from knowing what its absence feels like. The improved nutrition will have effects that ripple forward through generations. Better-fed children grow into stronger adults, more capable of work, more resistant to disease, more likely to survive to have children of their own. The population will eventually recover from the plague's devastation, but it will recover as a healthier, better-nourished population. The catastrophe, in this perverse way, has culled the weak and given the survivors resources to thrive. Walking through the village after your meal, you observe the signs of dietary improvement everywhere. Livestock that once would have been slaughtered young to conserve feed are now allowed to mature, producing more meat per animal. Gardens are expanding, cultivating vegetables that were once considered luxuries. Fruit trees are being planted with an eye toward future harvests. The landscape of food production is shifting toward variety and abundance. You pass the alehouse, where several men are enjoying their afternoon break with mugs of strong ale and plates of bread and cheese. Before the plague, such a scene would have been reserved for market days and festivals. Now it's becoming routine, a regular feature of village life. The economy of scarcity that shaped every aspect of peasant existence is giving way to something more generous, more forgiving. The afternoon sun is warm on your face as you continue your walk. Your stomach is full, genuinely full, not just temporarily satisfied. The meal you ate was adequate to your body's needs, not a calculated exercise in stretching inadequate resources. This physical sensation, so basic and easily overlooked, represents a revolution in human welfare. The plague destroyed millions of lives, but it also, inadvertently, improved the lives that remained. You think about the strange bargain that history seems to have struck: catastrophic death in exchange for unprecedented prosperity. It's not a bargain anyone would have chosen, not a trade anyone could have anticipated, but it's the trade that happened, and you're living in its aftermath. The bodies that filled the mass graves have become, through processes too impersonal to feel like justice, the source of abundance for the survivors. The sun begins to sink toward the horizon as you return home. Tonight's dinner will be another good meal, another portion of the inheritance that death has left you. You'll eat it without much thought, already accustomed to plenty, already taking for granted what your ancestors could only dream of. The plague is receding into memory, becoming history rather than lived experience. But its effects remain, written in the food on your table, and the health of the children playing in the lane, and the strange, guilty prosperity of the post-plague world. The scaffolding rises against the sky, a lattice of timber and rope that frames the church tower under construction. You've watched the work proceed for months now, ever since the village council decided that the old church, adequate for generations of worshippers, was no longer sufficient. The new structure will be grander, taller, more ornate than anything this community has ever attempted. It will also serve as a memorial, though nobody speaks of it in quite those terms, to all those who died and whose names are slowly fading from memory. The building boom that's transforming your village is happening across Europe. Churches, chapels, guild halls, private residences, new construction is everywhere, employing armies of masons and carpenters and craftsmen who can command premium wages in the tight labour market. The survivors, it seems, want to leave their mark on the landscape, to build monuments that will outlast the generation that lived through the catastrophe. The architectural style you're seeing is something new, though you lack the vocabulary to name it. Later historians will call it late Gothic, or sometimes flamboyant Gothic, a development of the earlier Gothic tradition that emphasises elaborate decoration, intricate tracery and soaring vertical lines. The post-plague builders seem driven to reach higher, to carve more delicately, to fill every surface with ornament. It's as if the proximity of death has intensified the desire to create beauty, to assert human creativity against the void. You watch the masons at work, shaping stone with practiced precision, and you marvel at the skill on display. These are well-paid professionals, men who've benefited enormously from the labour shortage, who travel from project to project as demand dictates. Before the plague, such craftsmen might have spent their entire careers on a single great cathedral, working for wages that barely sustained their families. Now they can pick and choose, negotiate terms, walk away from employers who don't meet their expectations. The church tower grows week by week, its stone courses rising toward the clouds. When it's finished, it will be visible from miles away, a landmark for travellers and a statement of civic pride. The gargoyles that will crouch at its corners are being carved by a specialist brought from a distant city, a man whose grotesque creations are famous throughout the region. Each detail represents an investment of money and labour that would have been unthinkable before the plague made such investments possible. Memorial chapels are being added to churches everywhere, you've heard. Wealthy families commission elaborate stone tombs for relatives who died in the plague, often decades after the deaths occurred. Chantries are endowed, funds set aside to pay priests to say masses in perpetuity for the souls of the departed. The church, despite its damaged authority, is benefiting financially from the commemorative impulse, as guilt and grief translate into donations and bequests. The quirky architectural detail that fascinates you is the popularity of transy tombs, those double-decker monuments that show the deceased in two states, alive above and decomposing below. You remember the morbid art that emerged right after the plague, the dance of death imagery, the memento mori reminders of mortality. That sensibility has found permanent expression in stone, in tombs that force viewers to contemplate their own future decay. It's gruesome, certainly, but also strangely compelling, a physical manifestation of the psychological trauma that survivors carry. The new church in your village will include its own memorial features. A side chapel is being dedicated to plague victims, with space for the names of those who died to be inscribed on the walls. A carved panel will depict scenes from the plague years. The dying, the burials, the survivors at prayer. It's an attempt to process collectively what individuals have struggled to process alone, to give form to formless grief. You've contributed to the building fund yourself, a few coins scraped from your improved earnings. It feels right to participate, to add your small share to the communal effort. The church being built will serve your grandchildren and their grandchildren, will stand as testimony that this village survived and rebuilt and refused to surrender to despair. The dead deserve remembrance, and the living deserve hope, and architecture can provide both. Walking among the construction site during a break in the work, you study the plans that have been sketched on boards for the workers' reference. The design is ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for a village of this size, but the council has decided that nothing less will do. They want visitors to understand that this community matters, that its people are capable of great things, that the plague diminished their numbers but not their spirit. The secular architecture is changing too. Manor houses are being renovated with larger windows, more comfortable furnishings, better heating. Townhouses are acquiring extra stories, expanding upward as urban land becomes more valuable. Even peasant cottages like your own are being improved. Better roofing, sturdier walls, small comforts that would have seemed extravagant before. The building trades are thriving, unable to keep up with demand. Historians still argue about the relationship between the plague and architectural innovation. Some point to the interruption in building projects, cathedrals left half-finished when the workers died, and the need to recruit and train new craftsmen when work resumed. The break in tradition, they suggest, created space for experimentation, for new techniques and new aesthetics. Others emphasize the psychological factors, the desire to create permanent monuments in the face of mortality, the urge to leave something behind that death cannot touch. What you observe, without the analytical vocabulary to describe it, is simply transformation. The physical landscape of your world is being remade, rebuilt, elevated. The buildings going up are not just larger and grander than what came before, they're different in character, reflecting a different sensibility, a different relationship to death and memory and the future. The plague has left its mark not just in the empty spaces where people used to be, but in the filled spaces, the new structures rising to proclaim that life continues. The sun is setting behind the scaffolding, casting long shadows across the construction site. The workers have packed up their tools and headed home, leaving behind the skeleton of what will be. Tomorrow they'll return, and the day after, and the work will continue until the tower is complete, and the bells are hung, and the dedication service fills the new space with singing and prayer. You stand there for a while, watching the light fade, thinking about building and memory. The people who died in the plague left nothing behind. No monuments, no tombs, no inscribed names for most of them. They were buried in mass graves, anonymous, forgotten except by those who loved them. The new church won't bring them back, won't undo the horror of those years, but it will stand as evidence that something survived, that the community endured, that human beings can suffer catastrophe and still find the will to create beauty. The first stars are appearing as you finally turn toward home. Behind you, the unfinished tower reaches toward the sky, a promise and a memorial, an assertion of faith in the future even as it commemorates the past. You don't know if you'll live to see it completed. You're not young anymore, and years of work remain. But you know that it will be completed, that others will finish what this generation has begun, that the building will outlast the builders and carry their memory forward into times they cannot imagine. The book arrives in your village by accident, carried by a travelling merchant who acquired it as partial payment for a debt. He has no use for it himself, can barely read, he admits, and offers to sell it cheap to anyone interested. You buy it on impulse, spending coins you probably shouldn't spend, drawn by curiosity about what words might be locked inside its worn leather binding. It's a copy of something called the Decameron, written in Italian by a man named Giovanni Boccaccio. A scholar passing through helps you understand the basics. The book tells of 10 young people who flee Florence during the plague and take refuge in a country villa, where they entertain each other by telling stories over 10 days. The stories themselves are varied, comic, tragic, bawdy, moralistic, but the frame that holds them together is the plague, the catastrophe that drives everything else. You can't read Italian, so the book itself is mostly useless to you as a text. But you handle it reverently, turning its pages, studying the script that curls and flows across the vellum. Someone wrote these words, shaped these letters, recorded these stories so that they wouldn't be lost. The book is an artifact, evidence that the plague happened not just here, in your village, but everywhere, even in the great cities of Italy, and that people there too have been trying to make sense of it. Literature you're learning is one of the ways survivors process what they've experienced. The Decameron isn't the only work to emerge from the plague years. There are poems and chronicles and treatises, some in Latin and some in vernacular languages, all grappling with the same impossible questions. How do you represent mass death in words? How do you find meaning in random catastrophe? How do you continue to tell stories when the world that those stories described has been destroyed? Boccaccio himself survived the plague in Florence, watching the city he loved collapse into chaos. His introduction to the Decameron describes scenes of horror that echo what you witnessed in your own village. The bodies in the streets, the abandoned sick, the breakdown of social order. But instead of dwelling in that horror, he uses it as a launching point for something else. Stories of love and trickery and human resilience. Tales that affirm life even in the shadow of death. You've heard fragments of another work, this one from England, composed by a man named Geoffrey Chaucer. His Canterbury Tales also uses a frame device, pilgrims travelling to Canterbury, each telling stories to pass the time. The plague hovers in the background of Chaucer's work, never addressed directly but present in the changed world his characters inhabit, in the social mobility and moral ambiguity that pervade the tales. Like Boccaccio, Chaucer seems to be using storytelling as a way of rebuilding, of creating order out of chaos through the act of narration. The quirky detail that strikes you, thinking about these literary responses, is how often humour appears alongside horror. Boccaccio's stories include ribald comedy, satirical jabs at clergy and nobility, celebrations of cleverness and desire. Chaucer's pilgrims include figures of fun as well as figures of pathos. It's as if the nearness of death has intensified not just grief, but also laughter, as if survivors are determined to affirm every aspect of being alive, including the ridiculous and the bawdy. Closer to home, you've heard of a poem called Piers Plowman, written by a man named William Langland. It's a more serious work than the others, a spiritual allegory that wrestles with questions of faith and social justice in a world turned upside down by plague. Langland's narrator searches for truth through a landscape of corruption and confusion, encountering figures who represent different aspects of contemporary society. The poem's concerns, the failure of institutions, the gap between Christian ideals and Christian practice, the suffering of the poor, resonate with everything you've observed in your own post-plague world. The literary activity isn't confined to great works that will survive for centuries. Ordinary people are telling stories too, sharing experiences, trying to articulate what they've been through. In alehouses and by firesides, around market stalls and in churchyards, the plague is becoming narrative, transformed from raw experience into shaped accounts that can be shared and repeated. These oral traditions rarely get written down, but they're part of the same impulse that drives Boccaccio and Chaucer and Langland. The need to process trauma through language. You think about your own attempts to tell the story of what happened. When strangers ask about the plague, what do you say? How do you convey the terror and grief and disorientation of those years? You've developed a kind of standard account, you realise, a shaped narrative that hits certain points, the first deaths, the height of the crisis, the gradual aftermath, while leaving out the truly unspeakable moments. The story you tell isn't quite true, isn't quite false. It's a translation, an approximation, the best you can do to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. Historians still argue about how the Black Death affected literature and literary production. Some emphasise disruption, the destruction of manuscripts, the deaths of scribes and scholars, the interruption of intellectual traditions. Others point to innovation, new vernacular literature, new genres, new willingness to address difficult subjects directly. Both perspectives contain truth. The plague was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, a destruction that cleared space for new growth. The book in your hands, the Decameron you can't read, feels heavy with significance. Someone in Florence, living through the same catastrophe you lived through, sat down and wrote these words, created these characters, shaped these stories. The act of writing was itself a kind of survival, a refusal to be silenced by death. And now the book has travelled across mountains and seas to end up in your village, connecting you to a stranger who shares your experience even though you'll never meet. You wrap the book carefully and store it with your few precious possessions. Maybe someday someone will be able to read it to you, translate the Italian into words you can understand. Maybe one of the children in the village is learning Latin and might be taught Italian as well. Maybe the book will pass to your descendants, who will live in a world with more literacy and more access to such treasures. The evening settles around your cottage as you sit by the fire thinking about words and stories and the strange persistence of literature. The plague destroyed so much – people, communities, certainties – but it couldn't destroy the human impulse to narrate, to shape experience into language, to share what happened with those who weren't there. The stories are being told in Florence and London and in villages like yours, and they'll continue to be told long after everyone who remembers the plague firsthand has died. You're part of a story yourself, you realise. Not just the story of your own life, but the larger story of survival, of a world unmade and remade, of humanity's stubborn persistence in the face of mortality. The words may not be written down, your life won't appear in any book, but the narrative exists nonetheless, woven into the fabric of history, connecting you to everyone else who lived through this impossible time. The fire crackles and pops, sending sparks up the chimney into the night. Outside, the village is quiet, its inhabitants settling into sleep, each of them carrying their own stories, their own versions of what happened and what it meant. Tomorrow the stories will continue, told and retold, shaped and reshaped. The endless human work of making meaning from chaos. The plague was the catastrophe. Literature is part of how we survive it. The Venetian merchant who passes through your region twice a year has changed his route, and when you ask him why, he sighs and launches into a complicated explanation involving wars, tariffs, and something about the Turks threatening Constantinople. You don't follow all the details, but the basic point is clear. The trade networks that crisscross Europe are being reorganised, old paths abandoned, new paths created, and the familiar patterns of commerce are as disrupted as everything else in the post-plague world. Before the catastrophe, you understood trade as something that happened far away and filtered down to you in the form of occasional exotic goods, spices, fine cloth, metalwork from distant lands. The merchants who moved these goods were figures of mystery, connected to a world beyond your comprehension. But the plague has made commerce visible in new ways. With so many middlemen dead, with so many traditional routes disrupted, you've become more aware of the threads that connect your village to places you'll never see. The Italian city-states, you're told, have been hit hard but are recovering with remarkable speed. Venice, Genoa, Florence. These names represent wealth and sophistication beyond anything in your experience, and they've suffered terribly, losing perhaps half their populations in some cases. But they're rebuilding, adapting, finding new ways to profit from the changed circumstances. The Venetians are particularly skilled at this, the merchant explains with evident admiration. They see opportunity where others see only disaster. Trade routes are shifting for several reasons. Some are political, wars and treaties that open or close particular paths. Some are demographic, ports and market towns that lost so many people they can no longer function as commercial centres. Some are economic, changes in supply and demand that make certain goods more or less valuable. The Black Death has reshuffled the entire deck, and the commercial map of Europe is being redrawn accordingly. The Hanseatic League, that confederation of German trading cities that dominates Baltic commerce, has adjusted its operations. Before the plague, Hanseatic merchants followed well-worn routes between established partners. Now they're more flexible, more opportunistic, willing to explore new markets and new relationships. The labour shortage has hit them too. Finding sailors and warehouse workers and clerks is harder than it used to be. But they're managing, adapting, maintaining their position through sheer organisational competence. You hear about shifts in what's being traded as well as how it's being traded. Wool exports from England have declined somewhat, as the reduced population means fewer sheep and less surplus for foreign markets. But the wool that is exported commands higher prices because supply has dropped faster than demand. Grain trade has changed dramatically, with surplus production in some areas flowing to deficit areas through networks that didn't exist before. The entire pattern of European commerce is being reshaped by the simple fact that there are fewer people to produce and consume goods. The quirky detail that catches your attention is the fate of the great banking families. The Bardi and Peruzzi, Florentine banks that once financed kings and popes, collapsed even before the plague hit, brought down by bad loans to Edward III of England, who defaulted on his war debts. But the catastrophe accelerated the restructuring of European finance, as debts became uncollectible when debtors died, and assets became untraceable when records were lost. New financial players are emerging, the merchant tells you, including a family called the Medici, who are just beginning their rise to prominence. The merchant himself has adapted his business model. Before the plague, he dealt primarily in luxury goods, silks and spices that only the wealthy could afford. Now he's diversified, carrying more ordinary commodities alongside the precious items, serving a broader market of customers with money to spend. The improved living standards of common people have created demand for goods that would once have been reserved for the elite. He's selling more to more people, making smaller margins but larger overall profits. You think about how this connects to what you've observed locally. The improved diet, the better clothing, the small luxuries that have become common, all of these depend on trade, on networks that bring goods from far away into village markets where ordinary people can buy them. The merchant is a crucial link in that chain, and his adjustments to post-plague conditions directly affect what's available in your world. Historians still argue about whether the Black Death helped or hurt long-term economic development. Some emphasize the destruction, the loss of skilled workers, the disruption of established networks, the decades required to recover productive capacity. Others point to the restructuring, the increased efficiency, the labour-saving innovations, the redistribution of resources that allowed survivors to thrive. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, varying by region and sector. What you observe, without access to the long view, is simply change. The familiar rhythms of commerce have been disrupted and are slowly re-establishing themselves in new patterns. The goods available in your market are somewhat different from what was available before. The prices are different too, some things more expensive, some cheaper, reflecting shifts in supply and demand that trace back to the catastrophe. Trade, like everything else, has been remade by death. The Venetian merchant finishes his wine and prepares to continue his journey. He has more stops to make, more customers to visit, more goods to buy and sell along his modified route. You shake his hand and wish him safe travels, grateful for the connection he provides to the wider world. Without merchants like him, your village would be more isolated, more dependent on what it could produce for itself, cut off from the currents of commerce that bring variety and opportunity. Walking home from the market, you carry the small purchases you've made. A few ounces of pepper, far cheaper now than it was a generation ago. A length of ribbon in a colour you've never seen before. A metal clasp for your cloak, manufactured somewhere you couldn't point to on a map. These trivial items connect you to vast networks of production and distribution, to ships on distant seas and caravans crossing mountain passes, to miners and weavers and spice farmers whose lives are as distant from yours as the stars. The sun is warm on your face as you walk, and the goods in your basket are evidence of a world slowly recovering, slowly rebuilding, slowly finding new ways to function. The trade routes may have changed, the players may have shifted, but the fundamental impulse to exchange, to specialize, to benefit from the different capacities of different places remains as strong as ever. Commerce, like humanity itself, is resilient. It adapts, it survives. You reach your cottage and set your purchases on the table, examining them with simple pleasure. The pepper will flavour your food for months. The ribbon will brighten your appearance. The clasp will hold your cloak closed through another winter. Small things, but real things. Tangible evidence that the world beyond your village still exists and still reaches out to touch your life. The trade networks will continue to evolve, responding to forces you don't control and can barely comprehend. New routes will open, old ones will close, fortunes will be made and lost as commerce flows along ever-changing channels. But the exchange itself will continue because it serves needs too fundamental to suppress. People want things they can't produce themselves. They're willing to pay for those things. And as long as that's true, merchants will find ways to connect supply with demand, no matter what disasters interrupt the process. The fever returns to your village in the autumn of your 50th year, and for a terrible week, you're certain the nightmare is beginning again. The symptoms are familiar. The swellings, the dark spots, the rapid progression from health to death. 3 people die before the outbreak subsides as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving the survivors shaken and reminded that the enemy has never really left. This is the reality of post-plague Europe that nobody talks about when they discuss economic recovery and social transformation. The disease keeps coming back. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was the first and most devastating wave, but it was followed by recurrent outbreaks in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, and continuing in roughly decade-long cycles for centuries. Each wave is less catastrophic than the first, killing fewer people as some measure of immunity develops in the surviving population, but each wave is terrifying nonetheless. You've lived through several of these recurrences now, and each one reopens the old wounds. The sight of a bubo forming on someone's neck sends you back to those terrible first years, to the mass graves and the empty cottages and the smell of death that hung over everything. The psychological trauma doesn't heal, it just gets buried under layers of daily routine, waiting to be exposed again whenever the plague returns. The generation born after the initial catastrophe, your children's generation if you have children, experiences these recurrences differently. They didn't witness the original horror, didn't see half their community die in a matter of months. For them, the plague is something that happens periodically, a known danger to be feared and prepared for, but not the world-ending event it was for their parents. They've developed coping mechanisms, practical protocols, an almost business-like approach to epidemic management. Historians still argue about the demographic effects of these recurring outbreaks. Some suggest that they prevented population recovery, keeping Europe's numbers suppressed for a century or more after the initial devastation. Others point out that the recurrences tended to hit hardest among the young, those without immunity, which had particularly devastating effects on birth rates and family formation. The plague wasn't a single event but an ongoing condition, a new normal that shaped every aspect of life. The public health responses have evolved somewhat over the decades. Quarantine practices, first developed in Italian port cities, have spread throughout Europe. Travellers from infected areas are isolated for 40 days, 40 giorni, giving the practice its name, before being allowed to mingle with the general population. Some cities have established permanent health boards to monitor disease outbreaks and coordinate responses. The idea that collective action can mitigate epidemic impact has taken root, even if the specific measures remain crude by later standards. Your own village has developed its own informal protocols. When plague appears nearby, the village council restricts contact with outsiders. The sick are isolated in designated cottages at the edge of the settlement. Those who've recovered from previous bouts, believed, correctly as it turns out, to be somewhat protected, take responsibility for caring for new victims. It's not sophisticated epidemiology, but it's better than the chaos and denial that characterized the first outbreak. The quirky detail that stays with you is how the recurring outbreaks affect religious practice. Each return of the plague sparks a new wave of penitential activity. Processions, pilgrimages, donations to the church, as people try to appease the God who seems determined to punish them. But alongside this renewed piety, there's also a growing fatalism, a sense that nothing they do really matters, that the plague will come and go according to its own inscrutable logic. Some people pray harder, others stop praying altogether. You've noticed changes in yourself as well. The terror of those first years has mellowed into something more like resigned acceptance. You take reasonable precautions when plague appears, but you no longer imagine that prayer or flight or any other measure will guarantee safety. Death will come when it comes, whether from plague or old age or any of the countless other dangers that surround human existence. This acceptance isn't despair exactly. You still value life, still work to preserve it, but it's a recognition that control is largely an illusion. The 3 villagers who died in the recent outbreak are buried quickly, their graves marked but without the elaborate funerals that would once have been considered necessary. There's no time for extended mourning when the disease might still be spreading, no energy for formal grief when everyone is exhausted from fear and vigilance. The dead are remembered, but quietly, privately, in the hearts of those who loved them rather than in public ceremony.
Life resumes its normal patterns within weeks of the outbreak's end. The fields still need tending, the livestock still need feeding, the ordinary business of survival still demands attention. You fall back into routine, grateful to have survived another visitation, wary of the next one that will surely come. The plague has become part of the rhythm of life, as predictable in its way as the changing seasons. The psychological effects of living under constant plague threat are difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. You see them in the morbid art that continues to proliferate, in the religious anxieties that never quite resolve, in the hedonistic tendencies that periodically sweep through communities determined to enjoy life while they have it. The plague has created a culture of mortality awareness, a society that can never fully forget that death is always near. Some people respond by clinging tighter to traditional certainties, seeking comfort in the church and its promises of eternal life. Others respond by questioning everything, wondering what kind of God would permit such suffering, exploring heterodox ideas that the authorities find disturbing. Still others respond practically, accumulating wealth and property and security against future uncertainties. The plague creates diversity of response, different ways of coping with the same unbearable knowledge. You walk through your village in the aftermath of the outbreak, noting who's still here and who's gone. The 3 dead, an old woman, a young man, a child, represent a cross-section of the community, a reminder that the plague takes indiscriminately. Their cottages will be occupied by others, their possessions distributed, their names gradually forgotten as memory fades. In another generation, they'll be just numbers in a parish register, if that. The evening light is golden on the fields as you complete your circuit of the village. The harvest is in, the winter stores are adequate, the immediate crisis has passed. But you know, with a certainty born of decades of experience, that this is just an interlude. The plague will return, next year or the year after, or the year after that. It always returns, and when it does, you'll face it as you've faced it before, with fear, with prayer, with whatever practical measures seem useful, and with the stubborn determination to survive that has carried you this far. The first stars are appearing as you reach your cottage door. You pause for a moment, breathing the cool autumn air, feeling the weight of your 50 years and all they've contained. You've outlived so many, survived so much, witnessed transformations that your grandparents couldn't have imagined. But the plague is still out there, still waiting, still part of the world you inhabit. It will be part of your grandchildren's world too, and their grandchildren's, for generations to come. You go inside, light your fire, settle into the evening routine that has sustained you through everything. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small victories and defeats. The plague will come again, and some will die, and life will continue regardless. This is the truth you've learned to live with, the knowledge that the post-plague world carries with it always, that recovery is never complete, that safety is never assured, that survival is a daily achievement rather than a permanent state. The young scholar who stops at your village is traveling from Italy, and his eyes shine with an excitement you haven't seen in a long time. Not the desperate excitement of crisis, but the eager enthusiasm of someone who believes he's living at the dawn of something new. He speaks of ideas circulating in Florence and Rome, of ancient texts being rediscovered, of a new way of thinking about human beings and their place in the world. He calls it, with evident pride, a rebirth. You listen with the skepticism of age and experience. You've seen too much to believe easily in new beginnings. But as the scholar talks, describing the intellectual ferment in the Italian cities, the art and architecture emerging from workshops and studios, the questioning of old authorities and the celebration of human achievement, you begin to understand that something significant is indeed taking shape. Something that has roots in the catastrophe you lived through, even if it's growing in directions nobody could have predicted. The humanism he describes doesn't reject Christianity exactly, but it shifts the emphasis. Where medieval thought focused on human sinfulness and the need for divine grace, these new thinkers are interested in human capability and potential. They look to ancient Greece and Rome for models, finding in classical literature examples of human excellence that don't depend entirely on religious framework. They're asking what human beings can achieve in this world, not just what awaits them in the next. You recognize something in this description, a thread that connects to your own experience. The plague shattered the old certainties, the confidence that faith would protect, that the church had answers, that the social order reflected divine will. In the space created by that shattering, new possibilities emerged. The humanism the scholar describes is one of those possibilities, an intellectual framework that makes sense of a world where the old frameworks have failed. The scholar quotes a phrase he attributes to an Italian writer: "Man is the measure of all things." It's an ancient Greek sentiment, he explains, recovered and repurposed for contemporary use. The idea is that human beings should be the center of inquiry, that understanding ourselves, our capabilities, our limitations, our potential for greatness, is the proper focus of learning. It's a shift from the God-centered thinking that dominated medieval intellectual life. Not a rejection of God, but a rebalancing of attention. You think about how this connects to what you've observed over the decades since the plague: the questioning of church authority, the skepticism toward received wisdom, the emphasis on practical experience over theoretical abstraction, the celebration of human achievement in art and architecture and technology. All of these trends, which you've witnessed without quite understanding their significance, are part of the same larger movement, the same gradual reorientation of European culture. The scholar is particularly excited about education. The old university curriculum, focused narrowly on logic, theology, law, and medicine, is being supplemented, in some places replaced, by a broader approach that includes grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. The goal is to produce well-rounded individuals capable of civic participation and ethical reflection, not just specialists trained for particular professions. This educational revolution, the scholar believes, will transform society over time. Historians still argue about the relationship between the Black Death and the Renaissance, that flowering of art and culture that will eventually be seen as marking the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern. Some emphasize continuity, noting that many Renaissance developments were already underway before the plague. Others see the catastrophe as a crucial turning point, creating the psychological and economic conditions that made the Renaissance possible. The truth, as usual, probably involves both perspectives. The quirky detail that catches your attention is the scholar's description of how wealthy patrons are commissioning art that celebrates earthly life. Portraits of themselves and their families, depictions of classical mythology, scenes of everyday activity, rendered with unprecedented realism. Before the plague, art served primarily religious purposes, pointing viewers toward heaven and eternal truths. Now, art is also celebrating the here and now, the beauty of the physical world, the achievement of individual human beings. You think about the dance of death imagery that emerged right after the plague, the morbid art that reminded everyone of mortality. That impulse hasn't disappeared. Memento mori remains a powerful theme, but it's being supplemented by something else, a determination to make the most of earthly life precisely because it's fleeting. The awareness of death, paradoxically, is feeding a celebration of life. The scholar stays the night, sharing more of his ideas by firelight. He speaks of a new confidence emerging among educated people, a sense that human reason can understand the world, and human action can improve it. The plague proved that the old authorities were fallible, that traditional knowledge couldn't prevent catastrophe, but instead of leading to despair, this realization is leading to a kind of liberation. If the old answers were inadequate, perhaps new answers can be found. If human beings couldn't be saved by blind faith, perhaps they can be saved by learning and effort. You're too old and too tired to be swept up in the scholar's enthusiasm, but you can see the appeal of what he's describing. A world where human beings are valued for their own sake, where learning is pursued not just for religious purposes, but for the pleasure of understanding, where art celebrates beauty and individual achievement. This would be a different world from the one you were born into, a world with more room for hope and possibility. Walking the scholar to the edge of the village the next morning, you offer him the blessing of someone who's seen too much to be easily impressed, but who recognizes genuine significance when he encounters it. The ideas he carries may not transform your own remaining years, but they will shape the world your grandchildren inherit. The catastrophe you survived is becoming, slowly and painfully, the foundation for something new. You watch him disappear down the road, heading south toward the centers of this nascent movement, and you think about endings and beginnings. The plague was an ending, the end of a medieval world that had seemed permanent and stable. But endings create space for beginnings, and what's beginning now, in the studios of Florence and the libraries of Rome and the conversations of traveling scholars, will eventually reshape everything. The morning sun is bright on the fields as you return to your cottage. There's work to be done, as always, the endless cycle of tasks that sustains human life. But you carry with you a new sense of context, a glimpse of the larger pattern that your individual existence fits into. The world is changing, has been changing since the plague swept through, and the changes are adding up to something, pointing toward a future that will be different from the past. You're not sure you'll see that future. Your years are numbered, you know that clearly. But you've contributed to it, simply by surviving, by rebuilding, by participating in the countless small transformations that are reshaping European society. The catastrophe you endured wasn't meaningless. It was, strange as it sounds, the painful birth of a new world. And that new world, whatever form it takes, will carry the memory of those who lived through the transition, who suffered and adapted and persisted until something better could emerge. You sit by your fire on a winter evening, old now, your joints aching with the cold, your memory full of things that younger people cannot quite believe. The village outside your cottage has changed so much since your childhood that a visitor from those early years wouldn't recognize it. New buildings stand where old ones fell. New families live where extinct lineages once dwelled. The very rhythm of life has shifted, faster and more varied than the steady patterns your grandparents knew. The legacy of the Black Death surrounds you, though most people no longer think of it that way. The wages your neighbors earn, higher than any medieval peasant could have dreamed of, trace back to the labor shortage the plague created. The freedom they enjoy, to move and work and negotiate terms, grew from the breakdown of serfdom that the catastrophe accelerated. The skepticism they show toward authorities, both religious and secular, echoes the doubts that mass death planted in the minds of survivors. Everything that seems normal to the younger generation is actually the fruit of abnormality, the strange harvest of unprecedented disaster. You've watched the transformation unfold across your entire lifetime, and you've tried to understand it, though understanding comes hard when you're living inside the changes rather than observing them from outside. The world of your grandparents, rigid, hierarchical, bound by custom and obligation, has given way to something more fluid, more uncertain, more open to individual initiative. The exchange between lord and peasant, which once seemed as fixed as the relationship between sun and earth, has been renegotiated, adjusted, in some places abolished entirely. The church, which once commanded unquestioning obedience, now faces competition, from skeptics who doubt its teachings, from reformers who challenge its practices, from ordinary believers who've learned to trust their own spiritual intuitions alongside clerical guidance. The plague proved that faith alone couldn't protect anyone, and that lesson has sunk deep into European consciousness. People still believe, still pray, still seek salvation. But they do so with a new awareness that the institutions claiming to mediate between humanity and God are fallible, human, capable of error. The economy has been transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to your younger self. Remember Thomas the tanner, whose workshop fell silent when he and his family died? Remember how you longed to smell that terrible stench again, because it would mean the world was normal? The tanning trade has changed now, concentrated in larger operations, using techniques that would have been unfamiliar to Thomas. The whole organization of production has shifted, moving towards specialization and efficiency, responding to a world where labor is precious and must be used wisely. You think about the art you've seen, the churches you've entered, the books you've handled without being able to read them. The morbid imagery that emerged right after the plague, the dancing skeletons, the rotting corpses, has mellowed into something more complex, a cultural awareness of mortality that coexists with celebration of life. The artists of the Italian cities, you've heard, are creating works of unprecedented beauty, celebrating human form and human achievement in ways that would have seemed almost pagan to the pious of earlier generations. The trauma has been transmuted, slowly, into creativity. The technology that surrounds you reflects the same transformation. Remember the windmill that rose on the ridge, replacing the abandoned water mill? That was just the beginning of a wave of innovation, driven by the need to accomplish more with fewer hands. The tools in every workshop are better than they were. The techniques in every field are more refined. Human ingenuity, freed from the constraints of abundant cheap labor, has flourished in ways your grandparents couldn't have imagined. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was ultimately good or bad for European development. The question itself seems almost obscene. How can you weigh economic progress against millions of dead? But the argument persists because the evidence is genuinely complex. The plague destroyed lives, families, communities, entire ways of being. It also created conditions for wages to rise, serfdom to dissolve, technology to advance, culture to transform. The same catastrophe that killed half of Europe also, paradoxically, laid the groundwork for European modernity. The quirky detail that returns to you, sitting by your fire, is how quickly the unthinkable became normal. You remember when mass death was shocking, when empty cottages were traumatic, when the silence of depopulated villages pressed against your ears like a physical weight. Now a generation has grown up for whom the post-plague world is simply the world, the only reality they've ever known. They take for granted conditions that seemed miraculous to survivors: the wages, the food, the freedom, the opportunities. They don't know how different things were, can't fully grasp what was lost to create what they have. You are one of the last bridges to that earlier world, one of the few remaining people who remember what life was like before. When you die, and you know that day is approaching, can feel it in your bones and your breath, that direct connection will be severed. The plague will become pure history, something that happened to other people in another time, no longer something that living memory can testify to. Your grandchildren's grandchildren will read about it in books, if they read at all, and they'll struggle to comprehend the reality behind the words. But perhaps that's as it should be. Trauma fades, memory dims. New generations deserve to live forward, not backward, to build their futures rather than mourning your past. The world you'll leave behind is better in many ways than the world you were born into. More prosperous, more free, more open to human flourishing. That's not nothing. That's worth something. Even if it came at a cost nobody would have chosen to pay. The fire burns low, and you add another log, watching the sparks spiral upward into the darkness. Outside, snow is falling, soft and silent, covering the village in white. Somewhere a dog is barking, that eternal sound of ordinary life continuing. The plague is receding, generation by generation, into the distance of history. What remains is the world it made, the strange and painful and ultimately hopeful world that emerged from the ashes of catastrophe. You close your eyes, letting the warmth of the fire soak into your aged body, and you think about all the people you've known who didn't make it this far. Your parents and grandparents, your neighbors and friends, the countless dead whose names are already half forgotten. You've carried them with you all these years, their memories a weight you couldn't set down. But perhaps now, in the twilight of your own life, you can begin to let them rest. They've been part of your story, and your story has been part of the larger story, and that larger story continues even as individual stories end. The snow keeps falling outside your window, gentle and persistent, transforming the familiar landscape into something new. Tomorrow the children will play in it, their laughter echoing through the village, their lives unfolding in a world that the plague made possible. They won't know, can't know, what it cost, but they'll live it, and that's enough. Your breathing slows as sleep approaches, the fire crackling softly, the night settling around you like a blanket. You've survived. You've witnessed. You've been part of something so large it defies comprehension. And now, in the quiet of a winter evening, you can finally rest, trusting that the world will continue without you, that the story will go on, that the strange gift of survival will be passed down through generations you'll never see. The world after the Black Death is settling into its new shape, becoming the foundation for centuries of change to come. You've been part of that settling, one small life in a vast transformation. And as you drift toward sleep, the last embers glowing in your hearth, you feel something like peace. Not the peace of answers, but the peace of acceptance, of a story told as well as it could be told, of a life lived as fully as circumstances allowed. Sleep now. The snow is falling. The children are dreaming of tomorrow. And somewhere, in places you'll never see, the future is already beginning. A future that carries your world inside it. Transformed but not erased. Remembered even when the remembering becomes history rather than memory. And so you rest now, letting these distant centuries fade like wood smoke dissolving into evening air. The village grows quiet around you, and the fire in your hearth burns down to gentle embers, their glow soft and warm against the gathering darkness. The voices of the past, the merchants and scholars, the peasants and lords, the survivors who rebuilt their shattered world, grow hushed now, settling into the silence like snow settling onto frozen fields. Your breathing slows, deepens, finds its natural rhythm. The weight of history lifts from your shoulders, and you feel yourself floating in that comfortable space between waking and dreaming, where time loses its sharp edges and everything blends into peaceful continuity. The plague and its aftermath, the transformations and the traumas, all of it recedes now, becoming distant, becoming soft, becoming simply a story that has been told and can now be set aside. The night wraps around you like a familiar blanket, and you are safe, and you are warm, and the world outside your window is quiet and still. Let your thoughts drift where they will, carried on currents of sleep toward whatever gentle shores await. The past has been honored, the present moment holds you, and the future, whatever it brings, will wait until morning. Rest now. You've journeyed far tonight, through centuries of change and upheaval, and you've earned this peace. Let go of the waking world, and let the soft darkness carry you down, down, into the deep and dreamless sleep that restores and renews. The story is complete, the night is kind, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sweet dreams.